Hello? Hello? Hello. Good evening. I hope you can hear me. Yes, you can. I'm Henry Porter. I direct this convention, and this is Naomi Smith, who's going to be your host this evening. I am really impressed to see all of you come out on this difficult evening, June the 4th, when Donald Trump occupies the centre of London. But thank you for coming. You obviously think, as I do, that the threats of dark money and the abuse of personal data in social media are very dangerous to our democracy and the rule of law. So I'm grateful to find kindred spirits. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, 20 speakers in 2.5 hours. It's going to be breakneck speed. Heroes of mine like Carole Cadwalladr, Dominic Grieve is going to open for us. Lord Neuberger, I particularly want to thank, who was the Supreme Court President between 2012 and 2017, is going to give a speech. Jo Swinson, Stephen Kinnock, and many of the experts, journalists, lawyers, who really are, if I don't put too fine a point on it, the defenders of our civil society. I welcome them. I need to tell you that this is going to be filmed. That's, I think, a legal requirement. It's going to be live streamed from now on. One or two things I want to say about having so many lawyers in the room. I think there are 3 or 4 QCs going to be here. So that's to advise my many friends in the investigative journalist community to mind what they say. We are not platforming people to break the libel laws here. The second tradition of the convention, which Anthony Barnett and I founded in 2008, this is the 4th convention, is that we conduct our proceedings with respect and politeness. And this has always been actually something that has been marvelous to me. But actually, it's ever more important that we can hold this serious debate at a time when, Parliament is in disarray. And when you turn on the TV and look at one of the discussion programs, you find people in such a lather of hatred and vanity. I think this is a wonderful tradition. We hope to continue with it, and I really do thank you for supporting us. I think I've covered all the points. I wanted to say one thing about the team who put this together in a very short while. We did an event just after Christmas in 11 days. This effectively was done in a much shorter time. It's an international team, Swedish, French, British, and Australian. And it is a really wonderful thing to watch. I have done virtually nothing all day since Julien Planté, who has done 3 of these events now, took over and basically makes the whole thing work. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Naomi Smith, who is the COO of Best for Britain and a star of the podcast community.
I think I don't need it. Good evening, everybody. Well, is that a bit loud? I'll try and, I'm so used to having to project, and now I've got it right by my mouth. I don't need to. Thank you very much, Henry. And just before we begin, Henry was very gracious in thanking everybody else who's helped bring tonight together. But I think if we just give him a round of applause too, because really without him it wouldn't happen. Thank you very much, Henry. So, hello, I am Naomi. I am the COO of the anti-Brexit campaign Best for Britain. Not all of our speakers tonight are anti-Brexit. Some of them think that we should leave the EU. But all of them have concerns about the threats to our liberal democracy. And of course, one of those threats is in town today trying to sell off our NHS. And I'm sure some of you have been out protesting against him today in the rain, as I have. I feel incredibly proud and privileged to be here tonight, surrounded by people like you, who want to know what we're up against. Hearing from our expert speakers tonight is certainly going to help campaigners like Best for Britain understand better what we're up against and how the dark forces are impeding our efforts. I also think it's worth mentioning that it was exactly 30 years ago today that Chinese students in Tiananmen Square in Beijing were massacred as they stood up for more democracy, greater accountability, and a free press. And these are all things that, frankly, are under threat today in modern Britain and topics that we're going to be covering tonight. I gave up a career in accounting and finance 3.5 years ago to campaign against Brexit, not just because I care desperately about us staying in the EU, but in no small part because I believe that Brexit, and more importantly the forces around it, are an assault on our liberal democracy, whether they are Anne Widdecombe's views on curing homosexuality, whether they're Boris's views on what business can go and do with itself, or Farage's views on immigrants. Our fight is so much bigger than Brexit. It's about the kind of country we want the UK to be. It's about protecting minority views. It's about protecting a vibrant civil society and standing up for the most marginalised in our country. So thank you all very much for being here. Thank you. And without any further delay, it is my pleasure to welcome our first speaker. He is the former Attorney General and no stranger to the convention, having spoken here several times. It's the Right Honourable Dominic Grieve QC, kicking us off this evening, talking about threats to our rule of law, and no doubt with the laser precision we all know him to be famous for. So please welcome Dominic to the stage.
Thank you for the welcome. Thank you for inviting me to come and participate in this evening's convention. And it is undoubtedly going to be touching on some very important topics which go to the heart of maintaining our democracy in future. How indeed do we maintain our democratic processes in the face of the development of social media and the arrival of dark money as a potential influencer over democratic outcomes? And during the course of this evening, you're going to hear from a number of experts on this subject in due course. Not tonight, I'm afraid, but I hope in the not-too-distant future. The committee of which I am chair, the Intelligence and Security Committee, will produce a report on Russia, which includes references, and I hope we'll be able to get some of it published, to Russia's cyber activities and activities on the internet, of which you will all be aware, certainly in the context of the US presidential election, was undoubtedly active both in hacking and disseminating information to try to influence the outcome, and also in trying to influence the outcome by means of bots. But rather than go down that road to detail which I can't share with you this evening in any event, I thought that the better course of action to start us off was simply to have a brief reflection on the nature of democracy and the wider threats which I think it is experiencing at the moment. When I go to address a sixth form, or traditionally something I go and do quite often as a Member of Parliament, and I suppose I've honed my skills down over the last 22 years about what I have to say, and if the topic is, could you come and talk about the democratic processes in our country, I always start by explaining that my view has long been that the purpose of parliamentary democracy is not for majorities to impose their decisions on minorities, but for a process of debate to take place which enables minorities to accept majority decisions. There are plenty of places around the world where one can see that whatever democracy in terms of majority decisions may be, the system has broken down and led to strife, civil war, murder and mayhem, because ultimately the legitimacy of those decisions is not accepted by others. And it always seems to me that it's a message we need to fundamentally keep in mind when we consider how democracy works. On the whole in this country, I think we've taken it for granted. was Churchill, who famously, coming into power after the period of the Attlee government and asked, "What is it you're going to change?" replied, "Well, first of all, we've got to allow the policies which the Attlee government have enacted to work themselves through and see what needs to be done." It was an acknowledgement that violent change or sudden change never fits easily with democratic parliamentary democracy. And yet, of course, what we are seeing today is increasing pressure with binary issues being brought before the electorate and binary solutions being put forward. Now, democracy is not for snowflakes, as I know as the recipient of death threats, but leaving those to one side, hideous imprecations and vile abuse, you have to accept that in a robust democracy, people are going to say things, firstly, which you vehemently disagree with, and similarly, people will express themselves in terms which you might yourself not wish to employ, but which probably falls perfectly properly within the canon of the acceptable to the person who's doing it. Somebody was shouting "traitor" to me as I walked down Whitehall only yesterday afternoon. But that's a very different thing from bringing into being a process of democracy where the binary nature of it causes endless confrontation. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, and I rather regret that some of us didn't speak out more clearly at the time when the 2016 referendum was being created and crafted through Parliament, its hideous reality was that it posed a binary question to the electorate, and on top of that, a binary question with at least one answer was entirely abstract, so that you could interpret in the word leave virtually anything you liked. And the consequence of it, as we have watched subsequently, has been to contaminate our political discourse. Because whereas the truth is that democracy is ever talking, it is a process by which we moderate each other's opinion by dialogue and influence each other, and you can't stop it, and you can't stop somebody having an opinion on one day and changing it on the other. The viciousness of what we have now created is that there are now tablets of stone which have been put up and to which everybody is supposed to defer as being definitive conclusions that cannot ever be questioned. That simply isn't compatible with working parliamentary democracy, nor with evolutionary change, and it's bound to put it under immense stress. And we can see that in the way in which the Brexit debate has unfolded. The attack on the judiciary over the Miller case for carrying out a perfectly sensible and lawful interpretation of what our constitutional requirements were for triggering Article 50, and yet denounced on the basis that in some way it offended the will of the people, whereas actually it provided clarity to a process where previously none had existed. And we can see it now as the debate has developed in the way in which our politics are polarizing, something which I view with great alarm, because ultimately, if politics become excessively polarized and people stop listening to each other, it doesn't matter who has majority or minority views, it will be incompatible with the survival of a free and democratic country. Now, to all that, we also have the challenges of modernity. I think it's quite important that we shouldn't exaggerate those too much. After all, dark money in politics has been around for a very long time. I served not so long ago on the Political Parties Elections and Referendum Act, which came in, as I seem to recall, around the year 2000. This was effectively the first time that there had been any proper opportunity to regulate the system of political donations. And yet, prior to that, I don't think anybody in the 1960s and 70s would have been saying that we didn't have a parliamentary democracy. But there's very little doubt that globalization now provides endless opportunities for people to seek to influence other people's politics. And when that's linked to the growth of a social media and internet, which allows for the rapid dissemination of information, and on which I regret to say people do seem to me to pay vastly excessive reliance in the belief that there are statements of truth contained in it. And on top of that you have the added problem that people can do this under the cloak of anonymity, and we know, and there is absolutely no doubt about this, that the system is being exploited by nation states and indeed organizations or individuals to magnify, amplify, or denigrate others in an artificial way by giving the impression that something is exciting great public interest when it isn't, or indeed seeking to challenge something by means of thousands of interventions which have in fact been generated by machine, then I think we do have, certainly in the educational field, quite a major challenge. And that, I think, is what this evening is correctly going to concentrate on. Just to give an example, somebody contacted me today saying, some of you may rather regret this, saying that Guido Fawkes had been explaining today that Heidi Allen had been encouraging me to leave the Conservative Party. Now, as it happens, I hadn't spoken to Heidi for about 6 weeks, although I did speak to her this afternoon. But it is entirely fake news. And the difference is that whereas if it had been published in a national newspaper, I would probably have written to the editor and just registered a complaint on the basis that there was no foundation for this story whatsoever. The fact it appears on Guido Fawkes means that I simply shrug my shoulders and ignore it. But I can guarantee that at some point in the course of the next week, various people will assure me that they believe this to be the truth. So politicians are labouring under immense difficulties now, both in trying to get messages across and also in trying to get truth across, and are finding it increasingly difficult for people to distinguish truth and falsehood, and this undoubtedly can be ruthlessly exploited by those who are unscrupulous. These then are the challenges we face, but we can't magic them away. We have to live with them. We have to try to introduce some mechanisms of control. I certainly think there are powerful arguments that anonymity on the internet is without justification at all, and that there is a right to know from whence comes those who wish to communicate on it. And we need, insofar as we can achieve it, to try to lower the temperature of our discourse and to remember that ultimately politeness, including to those with whom we may vehemently disagree, is the absolute foundation of communication. It is, after all, the process by which human beings have moved from being cavemen to the society we enjoy today. We didn't do it by banging each other over the head with cudgels. We did it by talking to each other. And it must be absolutely essential that our ability to do that for the future is maintained, and that people should have confidence that what they're hearing is indeed the expression of view of the person from whom they're getting it. I think if we keep those ideas in mind, then we will probably start moving in the right direction. And I hope very much that during the course of this evening, you will have an opportunity, as I will, insofar as I'm going to be able to stay, because I may have to disappear off at some stage to go back to the Commons, that we will all have an opportunity to drill down a little bit into what is a very important topic. And I'm immensely grateful to Henry Porter, as usual, and the convention for bringing us all together to do just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. He reminded me that the Political Parties Elections and Referendum Act that he referred to was 2000. I mean, that was, 20 years ago. Surely it is time for that to be updated. I forgot to mention at the start that because we've had to compress what was meant to be an afternoon-long convention into a few hours this evening, that we're going to be quite limited on Q&A. However, there will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end of Lord Neuberger's speech. So, if you're not going to get to ask a question of one QC, there are plenty of others that you will do tonight. But also, the Twitter handle at the convention that's up on the screen there and on your agendas that are in front of you, if you want to tweet a question to that, we will be trying to take some of those throughout the evening or responding to you at a later date. Anyway, next up is the MP for East Dunbartonshire. She's a former government minister for employment and consumer affairs, and currently she's the deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats. Jo Swinson is taking time out from her campaign to succeed Vince Cable as the leader of that party and shares her views tonight on the future of liberal democracy in the UK. Please welcome Jo to the stage.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for that welcome, and it is a great pleasure to be here and to follow my friend and fellow campaigner, Dominic Grieve, who we have been spending much more time recently together on the People's Vote campaign, and I think that cross-party working offers such hope for the future. We are living in a time where there is great threat to our democracy, to liberal values, and even to the importance of having a shared truth. You might have seen in the news last week some footage of Nancy Pelosi. It was a video that seemed to suggest that she might have been drunk or incapable. And of course, it was fake. The real footage of the event that she spoke at was uncovered and put next to what had been shared millions of times on social media. And it was just a window into what lies ahead, given the ability of people to create deep fakes. Currently, often able to be spotted, but will there come a time when such video technology becomes even more sophisticated and even more millions believe the veracity of it? We've also seen back in 2016 the stories of the bot factories, the troll factories in St. Petersburg, with certain Twitter accounts, funnily enough, tweeting the exact 8-hour time window of the working day in St. Petersburg and tweeting regularly on a variety of different issues from Brexit and Putin and Trump and Ukraine. And indeed, more recently, in our European elections, 5 of the top 10 accounts mentioning the Brexit Party on Twitter were producing more than 140 tweets a day. It's an average 1 every 3.3 minutes for an 8-hour period. Or over in Italy, there were 23 Facebook pages which collectively had more than 2.4 million followers, spreading false information on migration and vaccines. These are the threats that we face to our democracy and to our shared truth. But democracy is and always has been fragile. We shouldn't kid ourselves that there is a golden age where people were not trying to undermine proper debate and our democratic institutions. The difference now is that those who are intent on that have tools at their disposal that people could only have dreamed of decades or centuries ago. And of course, we have those various strongmen leaders, the Donald Trumps, the Viktor Orbáns, Matteo Salvinis, who constantly peddle a narrative undermining the free press, good journalism, peddling their fake news, hatred, distrust, and division. Do you know what? I've even heard that Trump thinks that today's protests against him were fake news. So, apparently that march I was on from Trafalgar Square down Whitehall, the good-natured balloons and placards and people chanting, that was all a fake. And apparently he had the biggest inauguration crowds in history too. As we say in Scotland, aye, right. So what do we do about this? Well, I think there are some good solutions that have been put out there by organisations like Full Fact to try to make sure we have a real-time database of online political adverts. There's currently very strong imprint rules if you're a politician and you're producing anything in print format. Funny story, I'm standing, as Naomi said, for leadership of the Liberal Democrats. And we produced stickers for our latest hustings that say "Join Jo" on them. Those stickers have an imprint in small text that say where they were printed and published by. And in fact, we got challenged by the returning officer at a recent hustings event that our roller banner doesn't seem to have an imprint on it. My agent smugly turned around and said, "I think, in fact, Darren, if you kneel down and look at the bottom, you will see there is an imprint on the bottom of the banner." We take this very seriously. In print terms, we have an imprint so we know where something has come from. We need to have a similar rule for online. Our regulation on digital campaigning has just not kept pace with where political discussion is at. And the Electoral Commission needs the powers, the resources, and the expertise to be able to tackle these issues. And we'll be hearing more about the funding side of this. The need to get dark money out of politics and to have a cap on donations, because that is one of the clearest ways to prevent undue influence. Now, we're not just where we are because of Russian troll factories and strongmen leaders peddling fake news alone. Truth, it seems, has been a casualty of these times. It is so important in a world where we face the existential threat of the climate emergency that we can listen to the IPCC and heed their warnings. But we heard in 2016 famously from Michael Gove that people have had enough of experts. Now, experts are hugely important, but there is a kernel of truth in what he said, because people are fed up with a system that doesn't work for them. In my constituency, a woman came to see me, Rosie. She'd left an abusive relationship. She was trying what she could do to make ends meet, but she had to wait 5 weeks for universal credit payments to kick in. And in the meantime, she was skipping meals so that her daughter could eat, or relying on the generosity of neighbours, inviting them round at dinner time. Today, I was in the House of Commons talking about the naming and shaming scheme for the national minimum wage, which the government looks to be watering down. You know, the fact that so many people in our country still don't get even the legal minimum when, let's face it, it's not easy to live on the legal minimum wage, but that there are still employers who will exploit workers in that way, of course they should be named and shamed. But yet the government rolls back from that commitment. The 2008 financial crisis, I think, was a huge opportunity to do things differently. And I fear that the world was too quick to get back to business as usual. Business as usual was not good enough. I think this is true of politicians of all colours and across many different countries. And what that did was it created a vacuum of people finding life too hard. And into that vacuum, Nigel Farage and others came along and poured their views about division. They poured their slick sound bites, their lies on the side of a bus. They stood in front of that breaking point poster and said that it was all the fault of immigrants. That was a captive audience that had lost trust in the mainstream. And there wasn't a good enough response from those of us in the liberal part of politics, in the progressive part of politics, to say that it could be different, that it could be done a different way. So I think part of the solution for us in how we take hold again of our liberal democracy that we share is to fundamentally reshape our economy and harness the power of the technological revolution ahead of us. We need to create a system that genuinely works for people and for our planet, and where business is part of the solution to the biggest challenges that we face, not part of the problem. I think we need to have a clear vision about the society that we want to build, and then dedicate and direct all of our resources to achieving it. Obviously, that of government and our public services, directing civil society and volunteer action towards this, and business and the private sector with all that innovation and ingenuity too. As I say, This morning, I was protesting against Donald Trump's state visit, an honour he does not deserve. He is a racist and a misogynist, and frankly, I do not think you can come here to honour the war dead when you talk about neo-Nazis as very fine people. We are right to protest his state visit, but we can't beat the populists with placards alone. No is not enough, as Naomi Klein so powerfully said in her book. We need to offer a yes, an alternative vision, one of hope, opportunity, and the promise that we will do whatever it takes to build a greener, safer, richer, and more liberal society, now and for generations to come. That's what we must do, and we must do it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Jo for reminding us that tech can be a force for good, and in fact, more often than not it is, and our tech community here in the UK are largely very, very good people that do some great work. They're not all the bad guys, although we're going to be concentrating on the bad guys tonight. Most of them do great work. Next up is a speaker who has been absolutely tireless in her pursuit of truth. In fact, reading her Twitter feed is pretty exhausting when you see just how much she gets up to. So she's been absolutely dogged in trying to find out the truth about how data was used and misused in the EU referendum by Cambridge Analytica and others, and crucially where the money really came from. And despite an orchestrated online trolling campaign against her, she has received several awards for her investigative journalism, and she is still fighting to uncover the full truth. Please welcome Carole Cadwalladr.
Okay. I'm at it. Just check, I know what I'm doing. Thank you very much. So it has been revealed that I'm quite nervous about the technology here, and I'm not entirely sure I'm going to work this PowerPoint correctly, so forgive me. But thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much, Henry, for organising. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm normally sitting at my kitchen table, gently despairing and railing at the dog. So it's good for me to come out and rail at somebody else. And I'm kind of unnaturally cheerful at the moment, which I was just shocking people in the green room. Normally I'm all about the dystopia and the gloom. But I really did get cheered up that we live in a country that yesterday, it welcomed who we call the leader of the free world, and this is how we greeted him. And I am so thrilled. I felt really proud to be British, and I thought, yes, we've got some fighting spirit. It's not all a disaster. And, is it blacked out? Oh, that might be a problem. Is the tech person around still? And then I got even more cheered up because somebody immediately corrected it for me in my Twitter feed. Oh, now you're getting it. Now you get. It's not a three-leaf clover. No. So, and I'm also delighted that Donald Trump is in the country. I just wish he could come to Britain, Britain more often, because I think having Donald Trump here reminding us of who his friends are and who his allies are is a very, very useful thing for us. So, Donald, please, if you're out there, please come every week as far as I'm concerned, and let us see you. Let the people in Britain, let them show their alliances. Because the problem, I feel, one of the many problems is that we have in Britain is that we look at Brexit as if it's about this thing up here, as if it's going on in Westminster, and that's how it gets reported on very much. And it's all about Britain and Brexit and this tiny bubble, and as if we're making the decisions here. And actually, so much of what is happening at a global scale, and it's happening in this place immediately below it, which is Menlo Park, Facebook's headquarters in Silicon Valley. And I suspect that a lot of you are here because you feel very passionate about Europe and Brexit and the European Union. And I am here for a different reason, which is that I'm very passionate about rule of law, and that this is not about politics. So I feel very strongly that what is happening at the moment is much, much more serious than just politics. And it is an attack upon our national sovereignty and upon rule of law. And so, I can't remember what my next thing is, which is why I have the slides to remind me. So this global connections, which we see, this is that the same forces are happening all across the world, and the same authoritarians, the same populists, which are being mediated by these tech platforms. And I'm just going to scroll through this. It was really this group of people here. A very significant pivotal role in this story. And I just want to get to this slide here, which is 25 yards down the road, Pret-a-Manger. And that was where, so Andy Wigmore, who's pictured here next to Farage, we sat down in that Pret-a-Manger and he showed me those photos on his phone. He'd just come back from the inauguration and he laid it out. He laid out these links between Brexit and Trump. And those are still mostly being ignored in Britain. And so Jeremy Corbyn, for example, he's been out, I think, on the protest today against Donald Trump. But he fails to recognise that actually he is supporting Donald Trump's great friend, Nigel Farage. And Nigel Farage's, we know that the criminal activities we know took place during the referendum and inextricably combined with, is the tech person around? Is this on? Never mind. So sorry, let me just go on. Anyhow, Andy Wigmore, he was the one who sat down in the Pret-a-Manger and he laid it all out, the connections between the same group of people in America and in Britain. And he was the one who told me about the role of Cambridge Analytica. And he said to me, the key thing, I've got my picture of my Petri dish, because what Andy Wigmore told me is that this idea that Brexit was the Petri dish for Trump. And it's up to you who you decide if this bacteria represents anybody. That's for you, not for me to say, not for me to say. And very, very central in this story are these two people, and they're very central in the story of Trump and in Brexit. So Steve Bannon on the right here, he was the vice president of Cambridge Analytica, and he was the editor-in-chief of Breitbart. And we know that on the day Article 50 was triggered, Nigel Farage was interviewed by Breitbart, and he said, "Thank you to Steve Bannon, and thank you to Breitbart. This wouldn't have been possible without you." And the thing I kind of always come back to in this story is that although there's an awful lot of scrabbling around and trying to find people to speak to you and finding emails and sources and all the rest of it, there's so much of it which is just out in the open and it's in plain sight. And that is one of the things which was in plain sight. The role of Steve Bannon and his benefactor, Robert Mercer, and that money which went into Cambridge Analytica and into Breitbart, and what Nigel Farage said was a pivotal role in Brexit. This is also in plain sight. You can see this article is more than 5 years old, it says. 2014. Nigel Farage asked who the politician he most admires in the world, and he says it's Vladimir Putin. And we know that Nigel Farage's voting record in the European Union is also very, very pro-Russian. This is not hidden. We don't need to uncover this. We just have to pay attention to it. I'm just going to scoot forward. This was an article which I published. It's more than 2 years ago. And it was about the links between Trump and Brexit and Russia. And none of those have been disproved. It's all worse, actually, than what was originally published in there. this diagram was something I thought I'd put up because, again, there's nothing here which, this was 2 years ago that this was out there. And this role, I just thought it was interesting because this role, so Cambridge Analytica was the company which was used by Nigel Farage's Leave EU campaign, and Aggregate IQ by Boris Johnson's. And, of course, the two very separate campaigns. And yet, here they are back in the news again. I just found it really interesting. They kind of went away for a bit. But now it is really about Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. And this was Trump 2 days ago, singing both of their praises. So again, it's linking back. We're really, really closely entwined with what is happening in America. Anyway, when I went back and I was just like digging out that article, just thinking, what shall I say today? And I noticed I had these quotes at the start of it that I'd forgotten about, and I just did think was quite interesting, and I thought I might talk a little bit about. So the first quote is from Alex Younger, who is the head of MI6. And in December 2016, so a year after the presidential election, he made this really extraordinary speech. And he talked about the attack upon British democracy and how it was being mediated by these new forms of technology. And I spoke to this sort of senior defense person at the time, and he said there was something really, really odd about this speech, because it's not MI6's job to safeguard us internally. That's MI5's job. And he asked, was it a signal? What was kind of going on there? Anyway, I just thought the thing why this sort of struck me again is because twice in the last year, Ben Bradshaw has asked in the House of Commons Theresa May whether she blocked an investigation into Arron Banks in 2016 when she was Home Secretary. And Theresa May has refused to answer that question. And I think that's really significant, because if politicians can deny something, they do deny it. And she didn't deny it. So there's a real question mark there over who knew what, and what the intelligence services were doing. And I come back to that question because when Boris Johnson was asked about possible Russian interference in Britain, when he was Foreign Secretary, he said he hadn't seen not a sausage. There was not a sausage. There was no sign of that. And that was our Foreign Secretary talking, and MI6 reported to him. And he was Foreign Secretary from June 2016. He was Foreign Secretary when Sir Alex Younger made that extraordinary speech as the head of MI6, warning us about the threat to Britain. And he was Foreign Secretary when, as we now know, Arron Banks was continuing to go into the Russian embassy. So this was a story that I did with Peter Jukes, who's coming up next, last summer. And that was when we discovered there was this covert relationship between Arron Banks and between the Russian government. And we discovered that in the same week that they launched the Leave EU campaign, shown here, on the far right is Brittany Kaiser of Cambridge Analytica, Jerry Gunster in the middle there, Arron Banks. In that week, they were inside the Russian embassy 2 times. And on the second time, they were being offered this gold and diamond deal. So we now know that. But we also know that these meetings continued after Brexit. So from June 2016, Arron Banks and Andy Wigmore were continuing with these covert meetings. And they were also traveling back and forward to America. They were campaigning for Trump. And we know that in the summer of 2016, the FBI were aware of Russian attempts upon American democracy. Five Eyes knew this. I'm sorry, it's a bit technical. But it's so Boris Johnson, who MI6 reported to, knew this. The embassies are under, the one thing we know the intelligence services do is checking who are going in and outside of these embassies. So I think Boris Johnson, that cannot be correct when he said he had seen not a sausage. And I don't know, sorry, I don't know if I'm pitching this at the right level, but I should just carry on blindly a little bit. The reason that I suppose what I'm saying to you is that this stuff is out there. So these bits of information are all out there, and it's just, as I say, like even going back, you see these things, and you start to ask these questions, because again, it is Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage who are the kind of coming men who, and there are all these questions about the past. So I'm just going to show you, sorry, this is just very quickly. The person they were visiting inside the Russian embassy was the Russian ambassador. This is an extract from the first indictment that Robert Mueller unsealed, where he talked about the Russian ambassador being a conduit between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin. That's there in black and white. So whatever was going on with Aaron Banks and Andy Wigmore, it was meeting with this person. And Nigel Farage said that he'd never met the ambassador. Here he is with them. Doesn't have a great memory, because when he was caught coming out of the Ecuadorian embassy and he was asked what he was doing in there on the steps of the embassy, he said he couldn't remember what he was doing there either. I'm just going to skip forward. I don't know how much time. Have I got 5 minutes? I'm a bit unclear. Let me just go forward. So I'm just going to sort of skip to the end and say, there are these investigations now which are going on into these multiple crimes that we know took place during the referendum. So this was the Electoral Commission did a year-long investigation into Leave EU spending returns. It started after the very first article that we published on Cambridge Analytica. They referred that to the Met Police. What's the date there? May 2018. Nothing. We've heard nothing of that. It's been with the Met for over a year now. Nothing. Then this one, Vote Leave. So this was Shamir, who's coming on in a moment. This was Shamir's amazing evidence which led to this investigation. That was July 2018. That was referred to the Met Police. Nothing. Again, that was after a full investigation to a criminal level of proof. This is still ongoing. The ICO's investigation into Aaron Banks' use of data, still ongoing. And then this one, the big one, the National Crime Agency's investigation into where Aaron Banks gets his money from. And I think there's sort of a certain amount of hope that, you know, this is our version of the FBI. And if anybody can get to the bottom of this, then it's them. And so I think there is a sort of a certain amount of hope that maybe we'll find out the truth about where his money comes from. But I think I actually think we just really can't assume that. And the money's offshore for a reason. It's in offshore dark jurisdictions. And I sort of personally am of the view that the law is not going to save us. And the regulators aren't necessarily going to save us. And so it really is kind of up to us to save ourselves. Because this is out there already. We know already that they broke the law in multiple ways. We know already that Russia tried to attack our democracy. We know that the Russian government offered money to Aaron Banks. And so there's still question marks, there's still a lot of question marks, but there is enough serious information out there for us to be seriously concerned, not just about the result of the referendum, but also the ongoing consequences of this, the ongoing distortions of this dark money in what is happening right now. Anyway, I'm going to skip to the end. Oh no, this is a good bit. Just let me give you this bit. This is a good bit. When I interviewed Aaron Banks 2 years ago, I asked him about this offshore stuff and like, how it's impossible to know where his wealth comes from. And I said, what about this offshore stuff? And he said, diamond mines. And I said, so the argument is that diamond mines are the perfect vehicle for money laundering because you own the entire flipping supply chain. So you own it from the mine to the shop, so you could just chuck in some extra diamonds. Aaron, but that's pure speculation. Me, yeah, it's pure speculation. Aaron laughs. you haven't got a clue if that's true or not. Which is not a denial. I just want to point that out. Anyway, I'm going to skip right forward, and I'm just going to end it here. We started on a giant penis, and we're going to end with Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage are the two pivotal figures who are going to impact what happens next in the next critical months, and that's the rest of Britain's future. And the cavalry isn't coming. And it's really about, it's about the law cannot save us. We need to make the moral case, and we need to make the political case. And we have to say, maybe the NCA cannot prove where Arron Banks' money comes from, but nor can Arron Banks. And this money, this foreign money, should be nowhere near British politics, and it is all over it. And we are the ones who have Nigel Farage's arguments most compelling. This is about sovereignty. It really is. And we need to protect our sovereignty and our laws. And we need to get rid of this. We need to stand up to this foreign money and foreign influence. And we need the truth about what happens. And we need to just... Yes, whatever. Oh, I don't know.
Carole, I had one question to ask from Henry Porter. So before we get on, we have a panel soon. My name is Peter Jukes. We're going to have a short film showing some of those dark ads at work, and then talk about how we save ourselves, how we combat social media undermining our democracy. You can take the lectern. But meanwhile, Carole, I had a quick from the boss, so I can't avoid it. What has happened to those investigations, the NCA and the Met?
So about 2 weeks ago, About 2 weeks ago, a question, one of the London Assembly members asked a question, Len Duval, and when Cressida Dick was taking questions in there. And she said that that's the Metropolitan Police investigations, that's about the spending returns. They said that they are looking at weeks, not months, for some news on that.
On scoping, they're just doing a scoping exercise.
But the thing is about it, I don't think it's going to change anything. And that's why I sort of, we know they broke the law. The Electoral Commission said that. So it's going to, it's going to look pretty bad. It already looks pretty bad. So
you said you were hopeful.
I am hopeful. I am hopeful because I think more people are getting this. I think, and just sort of incrementally, I think people are, the penny is dropping a bit.
Well, before we bring the rest of the panel on, if somebody's up there in the projector room, let's see how people were got at through social media. And here's a short compilation of some of the dark ads maybe you wouldn't have seen here if you were Remainers. Some of the targeting, the micro-targeting that happened if you're a wavering Leave voter. Can we start that short film? An idea. Sheridan, if you're in the... Thanks for that compilation. Joining us now, if you could sit there, this is Jonathan Sabir, who is an expert from Signify, who will tell us all about social media operations. Paul Hilder, an early digital guru and campaigns expert. And on my right, my beloved, I'm going to be very friendly with him because I so admire this man, Shamir Sani. So obviously, I don't have to introduce you. It's now been a year since Carole, with her amazing talents of getting people to come forward and supporting them. Over a year since Shamir's had quite a tough year, but things are getting better. You're more hopeful too?
Yes, I would say I am. I think the work that we all have done, and most of the people here who are speaking today have worked hard to at least inform the public of the level of corruption, the level of how wide and how important this issue really is. And so, yeah, I tend to stay hopeful.
Well, lots down to you, Shamir. Coming forward, if we roll back only 2 months ago, Vote Leave accepted their wrongdoing, having appealed it. You managed to get a certain organization, 9 organizations, not far away in a legal case. Just to update us, we'll get to the dark ads in a moment. Just that people miss this lovely little legal moment. You had a legal case against 9 organizations. Could you briefly explain on what they had to admit to settle with you?
So I, obviously when I blew the whistle on Vote Leave, I was fired from my position as digital campaign manager for the Taxpayers Alliance, right across the road, who are situated in a building called 55 Tufton Street. And so in my lawsuit against them, I sort of made the case that they had fired me unlawfully. They conceded on every claim that I made, which is not normal, admitting to firing me because of my belief, and I quote, in the sanctity of democracy.
Shame on you.
They admitted to coordinating with several other right-wing groups who all have huge platforms within public discourse and mainstream media, to coordinating a disinformation campaign against me because of the revelations that I made at Vote Leave. And so, yeah, now I'm just handling the settlement, but...
So amazing admission on their part. And, you know, one of the things we might have noticed when we're talking about social media is those organizations. I think there's going to be a panel with Mary Fitzgerald, which will talk about dark money. One might think about, you know, American dark money and Citizens United. But one thing I think is worth stressing in the year since I first met you, honored to meet you last March, it's not just social media, is it? I mean, a lot of the social media gurus you worked with who could be, let's say, involved in some wrongdoing now appear regularly on the BBC.
Yeah, it's a mixture of things, right? Social media isn't the only force in play that is allowing for the rise of populism or the far right. And it's not social media that is perpetuating racist sentiment. It is also the normalizing of that, of these values on mainstream publications and news channels. And I saw that personally, where I wasn't being given the platform to speak to the public about Vote Leave's criminality, yet the people who were involved in the crimes were giving one-on-one interviews with the leading correspondent in the country. And so there is a responsibility that media organizations have in this entire conundrum to actually not be non-partisan when it comes to criminals versus, like, victims. So, I mean, you'd think you'd think that'd be obvious, but the sort of conversations going on in mainstream media, not just the mainstream media, even in sort of publications that aren't read by that many people, is that somehow we have to balance crimes with the law. And sometimes you have to, like, balance, like, murder with the victims. That's not how it works. And that's, you know, that's what allows for the propagation of Islamophobia, of racism, of transphobia, of xenophobia, and all of these sort of extremely disgusting values.
There are two sides to Holocaust denial.
Right. Yeah,
kind of
well,
thing.
quite.
Just an example of that, I don't know if people remember during the tragic accidental fire at Notre Dame, that rapidly, and Russia Today, I think at least Sputnik was involved, a photograph of two suspicious Muslims leaving the blaze was photoshopped and shared on social media. And, you know, RT is a public broadcaster, not a public, a private broadcaster owned by Putin's friend. Jonathan, can I bring you in on this and just some of that micro-targeting? Jonathan spotted, well before Carole uncovered the truth around that time, the power of Cambridge Analytica. You can see the data floating around. To what extent, just picking up this theme, I've been told, for example, a certain Leave campaign, which now is involved in pushing for a certain Brexit party, particularly targeted chairs of constituency associations, of Tory constituencies, where the MP had voted Remain or looked to, or maybe was running a DCMS committee. Is it down to that level of granularity you can actually go, let's swarm this one person with trolls, bots, threats, and therefore you're not targeting the population, you may be targeting down to that level? Is that viable? Is that me being stupid?
There's certainly been an atomization of how you can conduct campaigns, but with great volume. So when you're talking about swarming and targeting people, it's not just the fact that you can target ads to certain groups that will never be seen by others. I think it was very interesting looking at the ads in the video just before, because there have had so many conversations since 2016 where you're talking to groups of people, and particularly in London, and if you talk about the kind of ads that were being run, and there were ads run around animal welfare, which is quite surprising, the ads about Turkey and the border with Syria, etc. So many people go, but I never saw any of those ads. And it's just indicative that because they lived in London and they weren't part of the target audience, they weren't even aware of that campaign that was going on. So you can absolutely go and target, and we've seen various different campaigns which have intensified over one of the key points is that the campaign has never really stopped. After the referendum, the campaign kind of for Brexit never really stopped. Vote Leave kind of wound down, but lots of different campaigns have sprung up since, and the proxy campaigns are really important. And they are running targeted campaigns. The one you suggest, I think I know who you're talking about. But it is possible. But with that targeting, you can also...
Aaron's calling.
The proliferation of...
You can bring on top of that, what social media allows you to then do is to, as well as you're targeting to a particular section of the population, whether that's a very small group or a broader town, city, constituency, whatever it might be, you can then run open campaigns that bring in a group that supports your ideology or issue. And often we've seen campaigns use threats and kind of really intense kind of pressure to try and pressure people in that way. And what's really interesting about that, and what's fundamental to thinking about social media campaigning at the moment, is that social media has no borders. So when you're thinking about politics, there are no national campaigns anymore.
So when we talked earlier, and Dominic Grieve said he was subject to death threats, called a traitor in the street. We've seen particularly female MPs targeted to a high level of threats. You sort of revealed something. You didn't name any campaigns. I'm not going to talk about names. But you can hire these people. Do you think people are hired to do that?
We definitely know about organizations that have teams. So when people talk about bots, often you think about kind of automated fake accounts being used en masse. But there are also a campaign tactic is to have a dedicated team of people who are just there to generate content on mass scale on one particular issue and just push that out. And they'll be pushing that out from a range of different accounts. So it's, you create your own kind of...
But down to the level of, I'm coming for you, here's your address. I've seen that sometimes.
Certainly we've seen threats. Threats have become a legitimate campaign tactic because they do affect the way that people operate, because people in the political sphere are just human and they react if they're getting intense threats, if they're under pressure, if they are having to have security and kind of, change the way that they interact, that has an impact on them.
Yep.
And there are cases where the people who are organizing that are close enough to the system to understand that that's a legitimate tactic.
And be deniable, they can't be traced, and they're anonymous. The other one thing, before I turn to Paul, so maybe some better news, is you said that people forget that it isn't necessarily about turning out the vote. And just bear in mind, there's a 2% swing would have changed the Brexit vote. That's one person in 50 needs to change their mind. Or not turn out. And you said sort of, I think we can mention that, a certain menace database was publicly acknowledged as a way of suppressing the vote or something, did you say?
Well, there is, I mean, we talk about kind of data in politics, and particularly in UK politics, but if we're nearly a decade of it being genuinely kind of involved. If you go back to the AV campaign in 2011, that's the first time that it really takes off and is put into use. And around that time, there was a database created that was nicknamed Metis by a political organization made up of different people from different parties. And the last time that they talked about using that database publicly, they talked in 2015 using it for David Cameron's campaign to target wavering Labour voters who might be scared off from voting for Ed Miliband. And that data hasn't gone away because it's very useful. Where it is now is a very interesting question. But social media campaigns, often you will see they're not campaigning specifically for one party. They're campaigning on an emotive point, and that emotive point can be used for different audiences, either for a positive action or to stop you doing something. You can become so angry that you don't want to engage in a process, or that's fundamentally what the undermining of trust in politicians is actually doing. It's creating an atmosphere where people don't want to engage in the process at all because they think it's rigged. And the fewer numbers you have to control to get over the line in terms of what you actually want to achieve in a political sense, the easier that is because you have a much smaller audience who's making the decisions.
And that can be done America does it extensively, but people telling me I needed my passport to vote. Because and they were. Just finally, before I turn to Paul, the thing I took away from you and take away what you say is that basically there's no national campaigns anymore from what you're saying. Money can come, this is another panel later, money can come from anywhere.
Yeah, so, I mean, social media does not respect borders. And in some cases, that can be interesting and maybe have positive effects. YouTube doesn't technically exist in China, but it's the 12th most visited site in China because people are using VPNs, and so you're able to kind of maybe use that to kind of subvert and change the media narrative there, and that might be beneficial. Turkey is also another good example where Turkey's a country that doesn't like journalists and arrest journalists, and YouTube is being used as a platform that might be able to help correct that balance. But in other cases, it can be really dangerous because, a very quick example, we looked at a campaign in Africa where some sexual health clinics had been prevented from providing services, and it was as a result of a social media campaign. And I think this will be mentioned in kind of the dark money panel as well. But the impetus for that, the kind of ideological impetus for that came from Europe and the US. The money fundamentally came from the same places. There were movies made to support this campaign in the US that came from kind of a movie producing house that is basically set up to produce ideological movies. That was then given to a local person in country who ran a proxy Facebook campaign off the back of that film, and was able to influence enough people kind of in the country to get these clinics prevented from offering their services. But if you're in that country and you're just looking at the social media, you think, well, this is a popular groundswell of opinion in my country. This is what the will of the people, if I use that phrase. But actually, it's not, because it's controlled from Europe, and the money's coming from America, and the money's coming. So it's
will of some oligarchs.
Yeah, there are issue campaigns now. There are not national political campaigns, and social media has allowed that to become a reality.
So, Paul, you began in a way at the utopian edge, didn't you, of social media, Crowdpack, all that kind of sourcing. And you've been through the whole Cambridge Analytica story, so I imagine some of these foreign campaigns are familiar to you. Can I give you a simple question? What went wrong and how do we put it right?
I mean, if I can give a lateral answer to that, what went wrong is oligarchy.
Right.
So it's actually not the technology that's the problem.
It's ownership.
It's where the power lies, right? Every technology we've ever had has been used for good and for ill. Back in the age of mass communications and the origins of advertising, you had Edward de Bernays, the original propagandist, getting all of these young women to light up on this freedom march just before the Wall Street crash, actually, and that was the origins of linking feminism to smoking, and then the Nazis created this thing called the People's Receiver, which basically locked down broadcasting in Nazi Germany, so that you could only listen to their broadcasting. But then you had somebody like Roosevelt using broadcast for good. So I think that you can use these networked social technologies for good and for ill, but you need to understand what is the landscape that we're playing on. And the landscape that we're playing on is oligarchy, it's abuse of power, and all sorts of loopholes and vulnerabilities in our democracies. So I think that we need to work at a sort of a strategic level and think very big about things like breaking up big tech. I launched the Freedom from Facebook campaign last year after I did some of my investigation stuff on Cambridge Analytica, working with one of the biggest antitrust think tanks in Washington, D.C., flying planes over their shareholders' meetings, all kinds of fun. And you are seeing over the last, 18 months, thanks to a couple of things. Firstly, the Cambridge Analytica story, which I think had this seismic effect on the public conversation. And secondly, the organizing that's taking place around that, whole series of people in the Democratic primary taking up that idea of breaking up big tech and taking it seriously, even Trump starting to flirt with it and the Republicans. Because there's a wind blowing, right? So that's one thing. I'd say another thing, Trump's flirting with it, obviously cynical, and he wouldn't follow through in a million years. But then, the next panel is going to talk about the money stuff. I don't want to talk about too much about that, but all of the offshore laundering money into the country.
What about other legislation, like the idea of GDPR or extended version of data rights? I mean, they're making their money on the data, which is very valuable. You're giving up from yourselves like oil. Oil's more valuable than data, and you're giving it to them free. Is there any way one can deal with that internationally at a sort of rights level, or is it the monopolies first?
Well, I think you attack it from every angle you can. I think that there is a big question about what's the new settlement for data, because there's a lot of potential public value there. There are people playing with ideas of data trusts and actually putting data in the hands of the many, not the few, but then how do you put safeguards around that? So I think that's a big and complicated problem. There are other people saying everybody should just own their own data and be able to sell it. The trouble with that being it's very kind of Tufton Street idea, actually. Look, sort of stepping back and I came into this, as you say, as an idealist who was going and doing network social organizing and building movements and platforms like Avaz and Change.org and 38 Degrees to try and reconnect people with power and try and renew politics in all sorts of different ways. In a way, I feel like the dream got mugged. In a way, I feel like the thing that those of us who were sort of looking carefully at the world over the last 20, 30 years, particularly outside this country, have always known is, abuse of power is a thing. Like, there were people running influence campaigns with British and American money in Iraq and all around the world. I went to school with one of them, bloody idiot. But, and just the nature of these relationships, fucking oligarchy, let me tell you this story. I still can't quite process this story. I went to this Scottish castle. My wife was a journalist. There was some PR thing, and it was the fucking elite. And there was this lawyer who'd flown his whole family up from his castle in Dorset. And I sat next to his business associate from Guernsey, who's his accountant, at dinner, and he started telling me about their offshore wangles. it later transpired that this guy's first name, Stephen, was the lead lawyer to the oligarchs, and his helicopter dropped out of the sky a couple of years later. But one of the other guests, there were actually two Lib Dems. There was Lord Thurso, who was a guest at that party, and the other one was Richard Allen, who is now the chief public affairs guy for Facebook in Europe. And this stuff is just, it's broken.
I want to turn back to Carole. Sadly, we only have 5 minutes left, but I have just time to tell you my quick oligarch story, which was a friend of mine met Oleg Deripaska with his dog. And I was stroking the dog, and my friend said, "That's a lovely dog." He said, "Yes, I've got 6 others cloned from South Korea." So he loved that dog. He had it replicated 6 times, which tells you about oligarch love. You, Carole, one of the things you did was to go into the lion's den. I hope you've all seen this amazing YouTube of a TED Talk. I've never seen Carole so scared but so brilliant. And she goes into the lion's den with people like Zuckerberg. Does what Paul's slightly talking about, is the shame work. Is that one way? You said the moral force. Is that one way? Can we shame and legislate these people to give our democracy back?
It's so interesting. I think that shame is a real key in this, because people have to work for these companies. Facebook has to retain its talent. And it's really interesting, because I was told that the wages in Silicon Valley are going up and up and up, and it's because Facebook is distorting the economy. They're having to pay so much more now for engineers to get people to stay. So it comes down to this thing again, which is a sort of the thing that I was saying, which is that this story is, it can seem really complicated. The way I told it, I'm sure it seemed like stupidly complicated. I'm sorry for that. I got a bit carried away. But there is some really, really clear moral lines in it. And that is the thing that has managed to have been kind of forgotten and obliterated. And I think you can see that so clearly with Facebook. Facebook, the United Nations, accused Facebook of aiding mass killings in Myanmar. How do you live with that? And they don't, and I've heard, there's been one interview I've heard where like Mark Zuckerberg has been really questioned on that. And he can't bring himself to answer. But that's the question we should all be asking and continuing to ask. And again, with what has happened to our democracy. So the fact that we know Facebook has this evidence about what happened, it has the forensics, it has these answers, it has been asked by Parliament multiple times to give it to us, and they're refusing. And Nick Clegg, who was a publicly elected public servant, is now, the handmaiden in that company, who is, passionately pro-European. But he is collaborating with them. I mean, my thing is, Nick, if you're out there...
Nick, are you listening?
If you're out there, Nick, if you're listening and you have the emails, it's that... Be a whistleblower. I mean, how much money is enough money? How much money is enough money to take from these companies?
It's brilliant. Whistleblower to Carole. She looks after you. Looks at me.
We can get you
You'll
legal
be looked
advice.
After. She'll take you for curry.
You've signed an NDA, but, we can get legal help. Just come over, Nick. Come over.
Well,
bring the data with you. Come back.
So that's one positive thing you can all go and do, is shame these people. Maybe shame Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson if they're working together. Maybe there's a bit of shame attached. Maybe the fact that Donald Trump is now saying he wants to gobble up the health service might make Boris feel a bit ashamed.
But I think it's so critical that we stop calling him Boris.
Sorry. I call him Johnson in my life.
It is not Boris.
In the paper, we always call him Johnson.
He is not cute and he is not charming, and we've got to treat him differently.
Yeah.
And he is, we have to hold him to account, and he is not being held to account. And that's on us. Again, that is on us.
Shame him and call him Johnson.
Shame you, Peter Jukes.
I put Boris Johnson in the paper every day. It was just
the reality is our politics has never looked more messy and more dangerous, and yet there is a lot of hope. I think there's a lot of hope in the extent to which we are starting to expose some of the malefactors. I'd encourage everybody, by the way, next month, towards the end of July, there's going to be a film called The Great Hack on Netflix, which Carole's in, I'm in, other people are in, which is about Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, all of that stuff. It's bloody brilliant. So I'd encourage everybody to go and look at that. But then we need hope as well as fear and exposure. We need organizing, and I think that people need to organize at the social level and at the political level. I just came off a bunch of work in the European campaigns all around Europe, and there was a sign projected on the Eiffel Tower that said, "No to hate, yes to change," which was the slogan for a massive turnout campaign, which was run by all these different organizations around Europe. The Greens did bloody brilliantly, lots of good people did brilliantly, the populists underperformed. So we've got a lot of hope.
And big penises. And as buy donkeys and people like that messaging big penises, as you began with, for Trump. So, thank you, everybody. We'll now go move on to the next panel.
We're running really over time, so we are going to try and claw back some of that. So we've found out what they do to subvert democracy on social media, and now we're going to find out about how they fund it through dark money. So here to discuss this, we have... Are they all ready to step onto the stage? Oh no, I think they're just changing their mics over. So I will now try and be a bit of filler for a couple of minutes while they change that over. So we're going to be talking about dark money. As I said, I am going to try and take questions when we hear from Lord Neuberger in the later session. And also Dominic is going to be joining him for that as well. So if you had questions for Dominic that you weren't able to ask at the end of his speech, we will be taking those questions. And don't forget to use the Twitter handle to ask questions as well, and we'll be trying to collate those and get you some responses to that. I hope you've been enjoying the evening. I'm sorry that we're running a little bit behind schedule. I think that was slightly inevitable given that we were packing so much into the evening session from the afternoon, but also just because we've had such excellent quality speakers who really do deserve to be heard and have so much important stuff to say. So, yeah, how are we getting on with them? And, I mean, anyone want to ask me a question while we wait? Hello, yes, there's a nice man with a question. If you shout it, I'll repeat it so everyone else can hear. No, just say it and I'll repeat it.
Marcus Ball is pursuing the case against Boris Johnson. He had got 3/5 of the amount of money he needed, but that was yesterday. Many of you will have heard that after midnight last night, it was printed that Boris Johnson is suing him backwards. I don't quite understand the legal niceties of it, but it's going to become much more expensive. I wrote to Marcus and I said, you should come here tonight. We should raise your funding so rapidly that people get scared. If we don't, it might fail.
Okay, so this is about the case against Boris Johnson. I don't know if you all heard that. And that was a plug for us all to help with their crowdfunder. I'm sure that the convention can tweet a link to it if anybody is interested. I think I saw somebody over here that had a question. Yes, guy with the glasses. Hi.
Well, it's going to be a question to the panel, but they're not there anymore. My name is Mike Butcher. I'm with Tech for UK. We've worked with Best for Britain on the campaign against Brexit for the last 18 months. One of the issues I've had, a slight problem I've had with the panel, everyone's amazing, but if you're going to talk about social media, you need to talk about technology. One of the issues, the reason that the Brexit Party has become so big so quickly is because they
Thanks, Mike. Thank you very much. That really is a crucial point, and I can't commend Tech for UK enough. They have been absolutely instrumental, both in bringing together the entire tech community of the UK together to campaign against Brexit, but also in terms of helping to build some of the really effective tools that we've got. Lots of people say, oh, we never make the positive case for Europe. It was through Tech for UK that myeu.uk was developed in the space of a very short weekend, and you put your postcode in and it tells you everything that the EU has funded within your local vicinity, from your hospitals to research centres, universities, colleges, clean beaches, etc. So it's a really fantastic tool, and that is just one of the things that they've helped produce over the last couple of years. So thanks very much, Mike. Have we got a Tom ready yet with his mic? Sorry about this. I tell you what, in case Tom's going to be a little bit longer, let's kick off with our next session. We're going to be talking about dark money, as I said. Obviously, Carole at The Guardian has been doing some excellent work on investigating the dark forces behind Vote Leave and Leave.eu and other groups. But there is also another organisation that has done some absolutely incredible journalistic work, and that, of course, is Open Democracy, who I'm sure will be familiar to many of you. Mary Fitzgerald is the editor, and she is absolutely relentless in her investigations in the funding of the Leave campaign. And Adam Ramsey is her colleague, who has uncovered multiple scandals in relation to rule-breaking by political campaigns and donors over the past few years. And Tom Baldwin is a former journalist. He's the comms director of the People's Vote campaign and author of a book called Control Alt Right, which is all about dark forces destroying our politics. So I'm going to ask Adam, you to go first, please, and we'll try and have a bit of time for questions at the end.
Sure. So Paul earlier said oligarchs, 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 and I thought that's a good place to start. We've done a lot of work on Arron Banks and on various of the funders of the Brexit campaign, and I spent a lot of my life going through, accounting and filing and so on. And I think that what I always end up coming back to is that where that money leads to is offshore. And you don't need to know much more than that to know that that's interesting. And so earlier this year, the Transnational Institute, which is a great think tank in the Netherlands, wrote a report where they looked at money all across the world, and they argued that now the backbone of modern capitalism is offshore money and the wealth of oligarchs. And where is that money held? Well, most of it in British territories. Britain is the world centre for offshore money, with our Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands and Gibraltar and Isle of Man and the City of London itself. More than half of the companies listed in the Panama Papers, the famous offshore leak papers, were listed in Britain or its overseas territories. Roberto Savioni, the world expert in the mafia, describes the UK as the most corrupt country on earth because all of the money from all of the crime in all of the world almost always ends up laundered through Britain or its overseas territories. And so to understand dark money in our politics, you first have to understand offshore money in our economics, that the British economy, the role Britain plays economically in the world, is as the world's money laundry, as the world's tax haven, as the world's offshore space. And the dark money that starts to influence our politics over the last decade in particular is a function of our economic role in the world. We've transitioned from a land empire to a finance empire, and in doing so, we've made ourselves the world offshore capital, and in doing so, we've attracted dark money to our politics to protect that. I think it's also important to understand another element of this story, which is also, I think, grows out of a key function of the British economy. So Cambridge Analytica has been talked about a lot already. What we often don't talk about is where it comes from. So Cambridge Analytica is the offshoot of a company called SCL, Strategic Communications Laboratories. If you go onto its homepage now, it still has a website, it will tell you that it's a defence contractor. So SCL, the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, is a mercenary propaganda agency. In 2003, when we invaded Iraq, Britain spent £12.5 million on private military contractors. By 2015, that figure was many times that amount. So, for example, one contract was given to G4S to protect the Afghanistan embassy for £100 million. And that's just one contract. And a part of that work, of course, is military propaganda, and that's what SCL did. It provided that function for our army that used to be delivered in-house. And what did they realize? They realized they could make more money if they sell those services back to America, back to the UK, back to the major democratic events of the world. And so they started to sell those skills to those same oligarchs using Britain's overseas territories, Britain's offshore space. And I think to understand a lot of what's going on, we've got to understand those two key things. But I think that tells us one other important thing as well, which is the main actor in Brexit, the main people who drove Brexit, weren't acting in the dark, but they were still owned and driven by oligarchs, and that's, of course, the media. Our newspapers are owned largely offshore by exactly the same oligarchs, and it's the media were the primary institution pushing Brexit and pushing a lot of our politics across Europe and across the Western world to the right. And it's not a secret. They don't pretend that this is, a thing they don't do. They very openly own our newspapers and very openly push Brexit. And so when we understand how dark money is shaping our politics, you've got to understand that it sits alongside the massive oligarch ownership of our media. And I suppose for me, that's why it's so important that we have independent media institutions like Open Democracy, where I'm happy to work, and lots of others we'll hear from today as well.
Thank you very much. Mary, it's not just Britain and Russia, is it?
No, it's not. Is my mic on? Can people hear me?
It is, yeah.
I told Adam to say that last bit, by the way. It's not just Britain and Russia, no. Can we get the slide up? There's one slide I'm going to show. If the slide tech person...
It's coming, it's coming.
Okay.
I can see a mouse moving. There's a mouse in the house.
It's not just Britain and Russia, you're right, and there's been a lot of attention, sometimes frenzied attention, on the role that Russia plays in trying to subvert our democracy. I agree that this is something that is attempted and that happens. But this was a piece of investigative journalism we did just before the European elections in March. And we just took, these organizations are probably not familiar to many of you, but many of them are household names in the United States. And there's about 12 of them there. And we went through their 990 filings, which is their tax return filings for the last 10 years. And these are large organizations that push fundamentalist lines on same-sex marriage, on abortion, on women's rights, on the rights of women and girls to access healthcare services, education. And it turns out that they've been funding all kinds of campaigns, political, religious, social, across Europe. In fact, they've done it to the tune of $50 million over the last 10 years, and that's probably only the tip of the iceberg. And who are their new friends in Europe? Who is their money and their services going to support? It's Matteo Salvini in Italy, it's Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's pledged to defend Christian Europe in his latest manifesto. It's the Vox party in Spain. It's all these characters. I think of myself as being European. I don't care what happens with Brexit, right? I think that we are part of Europe, and that what happens there is relevant to what happens here, and in fact is intimately connected to what happens here. Our former Brexit minister met with representatives from Spain's Vox party just about 6 months ago, one of our FOI requests revealed. And so I think where this money is coming from helps us better understand the forces that are trying to shape our politics and our public conversation. I think that none of this is illegal. This is not political campaigning. None of this has to be declared under current transparency laws. And we can spend a lot of time worrying about dark ads, which are important, and how many people are donating in rubles via PayPal, and what Vladimir Putin is plotting in the Kremlin. And we're not seeing the things which are sort of more under our nose, more out in the open, perfectly legal, but are shaping the way that we talk about things, the way we understand things, and the way that our politicians and policymakers form policy, make laws, and relate to the world around us. So go on, you're going to ask me.
So it's perfectly legal when we're not in a regulated period. And so for those of you who don't know, when we're in a regulated period, that's usually some months before running up to polling day, whether that's a referendum, a general election, or some snap European elections, as we've had this year. But it is illegal, so it is illegal during those regulated periods. And 3 years on from the referendum, why haven't there been prosecutions yet against those who were found to have behaved illegally?
Well, I think to your first point about legality, about unregulated periods, I think it's fundamental that we change our laws so that any money that supports political campaigns of any type at any time, there are transparency requirements around that. I don't understand why, it's a small number of weeks before an election when you actually have to talk about who your donors are and declare who your donors are, when in fact, as we know, Arron Banks spent millions before the regulated period, and tons of money is piling into all kinds of political campaigns outside of that regulated period. So I think the first thing we need to do is we need to have laws which demand transparency from campaigns of all political stripes all the time. And that would be the first thing we can do to fix all this. I mean, why haven't there been prosecutions? What did the Met say to us, Adam?
Politically sensitive?
Yeah, we called that. So Adam being Adam and not trusting anyone or anything, saw that Leave.eu was going to be officially investigated by the Met Police and thought, I bet they'll do nothing about that. So he popped a reminder in his calendar 5 months hence to ring the Met and to ask them, so what have you done with that big stack of evidence that the Electoral Commission have given you? And they said, we haven't done anything with it. Why do you ask? It turned out they hadn't even picked up the papers until a few weeks before. And when pressed, they said, well, it's politically sensitive.
And illegal, yeah. Tom, we're both campaigners and we're both facing the same struggles of having to raise money and, donors from outside the UK sometimes being more willing to fund campaigns in the UK than British philanthropists, for want of a better word. What do we need to do as campaigners in terms of recognising that we need to clean up our politics when the playing field isn't level? We're not fighting on a level playing field. So, to what extent do we have to just suck that up and call for a greater transparency when the other side just are going to ignore us?
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, there is already quite a lot of law around political donations in this country. I mean, I'm a big admirer of what Open Democracy are doing. I mean, in my earlier life, I used to be a journalist, and some of the stories I did, I exposed the Bernie Ecclestone donation, £1 million donation in return for favours for Formula One. I exposed how Michael Ashcroft was funneling millions upon millions of pounds into the Conservative Party via offshore accounts in Central America and Belize. He still ended up in the House of Lords. I exposed how a rare Liberal Democrat donor, Michael Brown, £2 million donor, was a fraud, and he ended up in jail. So, partly as a result of not just that journalism, but lots of other investigations, I think our laws around political donations are pretty good in this country. I mean, certainly, as a campaigner now, I feel the force of them. We've just been through a regulated period. I mean, could they be tighter? Yeah. I mean, in an ideal world, would we ban all big political donations? Yeah. Would we, do more to ensure sort of greater transparency of, small donations? Yeah. But I kind of think we've got to be careful, particularly, the movement here, that we don't make so-called dark money an excuse for our own political failings and our rather dark politics at the moment. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the closing weeks of the 2016 presidential election, Russian money was traced to be funding £46,000 worth of Facebook ads. That compares to $81 million worth of Facebook ads bought by the Trump and the Clinton campaigns. I don't think that Russian money can be said to really influence that result. I think there's when you look at Brexit Party's donations, the current controversy over how it can get lots of small donations, possibly from abroad. I mean, we can't have it both ways. I mean, do we want to take big money out of politics, or do we want to encourage small donations? I mean, the fact is, it pains me to say it, I hate it, but the Brexit Party is doing pretty well at getting small donations. Thousands upon thousands of I'm afraid, British people giving an average of £25. Now, I think we've got to work out why the Brexit Party has been successful rather than wring our hands and complain about the fact that maybe you can donate money from Russia. They can do both, but what's the biggest problem facing us now? Like, for instance, do I think, or do you think really, that we're going to persuade MPs that we need to persuade to back a people's vote by complaining ever louder that the last referendum the other side cheated? I don't think that's a winning strategy for persuading those MPs. I mean, I know because we're all talking to them. Do I think if we do get that people's vote, we're going to persuade millions of voters that we need to persuade to back staying in the European Union?
Shamir, come up on stage and we'll give you a mic.
I don't normally do this. I just
don't normally allow it.
I just don't think that's true, because at the core of this is a conversation not about Brexit but about democracy. And when you are winning a referendum based on cheating, that is reason enough for any MP to go, okay, let's go back and do that again. And like, despite my efforts to inform the public and everyone's efforts to inform the public about cheating during the referendum, it has been consistently just a few of us trying to inform people that the core aspect here is democracy. If MPs aren't listening to the fact that people cheated, then what else? It shouldn't matter. Fact of the matter is, people cheated. There's no ifs or buts about it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Tom, I'll let you come back on that and then I'll bring Adam in.
I defy anyone to be more admiring than me of the fantastic efforts to expose what happened in 2016. That's great. But I know, because I spend quite a lot of my time trying to talk to MPs about how we get a people's vote, that is not going to persuade them to give us a people's vote.
What I would add,
So the question, my question is this, really. My point is this, that it is not that, I don't think we should be worried about this, that we shouldn't be campaigning about it, that there shouldn't be a huge fuss about the fact that in lots of ways the other side did cheat. I don't think in itself it is going to win the argument with the people we need to persuade to get us that people's vote. And that's the purpose of the campaign I'm in.
And what I would just add to that is not only whether or not it persuades MPs is one thing. At Best of Britain, when we're out there talking to people in the country that we know we need to persuade, so sort of soft levers that might be able to be convinced over to our side, is that it doesn't persuade them either, because public trust in politics is so low that they assume that everyone was cheating. Sure. And they think that the Remain side were on the make just as much as the Leave side. And sadly, it exercises us, but it doesn't manage to persuade people in the country. But I would just like to give final thoughts to Mary and Adam, and then I'm afraid we won't have time for questions, but we will, of course, at the end of Lord Neuberger's session.
So I think it's about two things. I think the first is that the way the media tells us about Brexit and class politics around Brexit is that all of the elite are Remainers and the working class all voted Leave, which is just a lie. It's just not true. The data doesn't bear it out. And the fact that Brexit was funded by offshore money and oligarchs and massive tax dodgers is a way of inverting that narrative and making it very clear, no, this is the product of a feral elite. It's not the product of these sort of honest working class northerners that we're always told drove Brexit. Most Brexit voters are in the south of England, and Brexit was a product of an oligarch class driving change in their preferred direction. And we need to disrupt that media narrative, which repeatedly tells us, without any data or facts at all, that Brexit is a primarily working class phenomenon, which is not. And secondly, Brexit is more than anything else a product of the broken British state. Britain doesn't have a functioning constitution in hundreds of ways, thousands of ways, and we need to talk about that much, much more seriously. And my colleague Anthony Barnett, who's in the audience today, has written excellently about that. And for me, the point about dark money, and the reason I talk about, for example, the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands and Britain's role in offshore money, is that that is one example of the way that Britain's constitution is totally and utterly broken, and we need to become a modern democracy.
Thank you. Final thoughts from Mary.
I'm going to make myself really unpopular here. I am a stickler for the facts. There were lies, there was cheating during the 2016 referendum campaign. We cannot prove that if there weren't lies and cheating, that the result would have been any different. Nobody can prove that. If they try and tell you that they can, they're charlatans, okay? What we need is we need another vote on the deal, on whether we stay in the EU, whether we accept a deal, whether we leave without a deal, because that's democracy. Okay? We need that, and when that happens, that vote has to be held to account. It has to be held to account by investigative journalists who need to be far better resourced to call out the fake grassroots campaigns, to call out the dark money donors, to call out the fake ads and social media and bots and all that stuff before people vote, not afterwards. It needs lawyers, it needs campaigners, it needs a movement behind it. We need to understand what happened with dark money so that it doesn't happen again. But we can't roll back the clock. We have to have more democracy, not less.
A huge, huge, huge thank you to all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can we have the lectern back, please? Thank you. Okay, we have made up a little bit of time, so thank you for being patient. And clearly a topic that gets us all very exercised and that we need to know far more about, and so few of us really understand where the money in our politics is coming from. So perhaps it's fitting now that we hear from Lord Neuberger. He's a former president of the Supreme Court. It's only fitting, therefore, that he talk tonight about the rule of law and democracy. Please do welcome him onto the stage, and then Dominic will be joining him at the end of his speech to take questions from you, and I'll be facilitating those. Please welcome Lord Neuberger.
I suppose there are two fundamental foundation stones on which any modern civilized society rests: the rule of law and democracy. Freedom of expression and other fundamental rights are, of course, essential. But without the underlying structure of democracy and the rule of law, those rights will wither away, as will other features of modern life which we rather take for granted: public order, social security, free health, free education, and so on. So far, so simple. Every country, of course, has its own rules and principles about the way in which democratic government is formed and is run, and what its powers are, and what its legal system can and can't do, and how it should do it. But the United Kingdom is almost unique in the modern democratic world in having no coherent overriding constitution, which, for instance, enables judges to override Parliament when it's acted unconstitutionally. Parliament has no such feta in our system. Our constitutional principles are of the make-it-up-as-you-go-along variety. And similarly, as we've also recently learnt, even the procedural rules of the House of Commons are largely what the Speaker decides they are. But it's not just the rules that matter. At least equally important, it's the people who matter. A society based on the rule of law and on democracy depends on public confidence in the system, because a civilized system of government ultimately rests on public consent, on public respect. Obvious examples are the losing party accepting an election result, or the losing litigant accepting a court's decision. If public confidence in the system is fatally undermined, you can have all the well-thought-out rules and laws you could wish for, but the system will fail and anarchy or worse will take over. We've got to watch for that. Now, Great Britain is almost unique in another way. We've had over 300 years of existence without any successful invasion, without any tyranny, and without any revolution. And as far as our home record is concerned, we can justly pride ourselves on being a leading global force for centuries in promoting democracy, the rule of law and decency through peaceful, pragmatic progress. But as a result of our success and our good fortune, I think we've become rather complacent about the solidity of our system. We've taken it for granted, and that can be very dangerous. History shows that it can be all too easy for a country to lose its way, for a decent civilized government to be replaced by a repressive totalitarian regime like Germany in the 1930s. And indeed, the very tolerance of a decent government renders it easier to undermine the government, just as a repressive government can make it difficult to dislodge it, even if its time looks well and truly up, as in Venezuela. Now, the challenges we face today arise in part from problems which other countries face as well. The fallout from the 2008 banking crisis, inequality, perceived and actual, immigration, reaction to liberal values, unprecedented technological changes, especially in communications. But there are UK-specific factors which have discombobulated our political system. Our political situation seems to have changed very quickly from enviable stability to worrying instability following the June 2016 referendum. But I would suggest that the effect of the referendum and its aftermath have been reinforced by the potentially destabilizing effect of substantial changes in our constitutional setup introduced over the past 20 years. We've had devolution legislation which has turned the UK into a quasi-federal country. We've had the Human Rights Act, which gave us a quasi-constitution. We've had reform of the House of Lords, which changed our legislature. We've had removal of the Lord Chancellor, whereby we lost a reliable, independent voice for the rule of law. We've had freedom of information, which introduced a new dimension of open government. And for the first time in over 160 years of peace, we've had a coalition government. All that can be quite discombobulating. When one turns to the referendum of 2016, I would say that referendums are a somewhat alien novelty in a system with no formal constitution and with parliamentary supremacy. Under our system, the will of the people is expressed through electing MPs who vote in Parliament, and Parliament has been supreme with no constitutional fetter, as I've mentioned. Unlike, for instance, Switzerland, we have no tradition, let alone any rules, telling us how referenda fit in with our well-entrenched rules of representative democracy and parliamentary supremacy. Until 2016, there had been 2 UK-wide referendums, which had presented no problems, as the results had reflected the prevailing parliamentary view. And the same was true of the Scottish and Welsh referenda we had. However, when, as in 2016, a national referendum produces a result which does not reflect what the MPs generally think, trouble ensues, particularly when the issue concerned is constitutional and multifaceted. I have to say that things were not helped by the dismal quality of the political debate during the referendum. Even to those cynical about the level of political debate generally, this was a low point. The Remainers lazily confident in the main, mounting a negative campaign based on overstated fears bordering at times on hysteria. The Leavers, mostly knowing that individually they wouldn't have to deliver even if they won, relied on a combination of unrealistic threats and Pied Piper promises. Another serious problem, was that the Brexit referendum was an unguided missile. Parliament left a vacuum in the statute when it came to stating what the effect of a leave vote would be. This was in stark contrast with the 2014 Scottish Independence Referendum Act, where Parliament spelt out the consequences and the timetable of an independence vote. Indeed, as a matter of strict law, the EU referendum had no effect. Politically, this vacuum has been filled by a mass of dissonant, passionate voices because there are, as has been pointed out, a large number of perfectly legitimate views as to the terms upon which we should leave the EU and the terms of the relationship thereafter. And as every alternative leaves us worse off than the status quo, at least for the foreseeable future, it's scarcely surprising that there's no majority for any solution. Furthermore, very unusually, Brexit is a major political issue which does not split people along party lines. This makes for a very uncomfortable situation in the House of Commons, which has historically been closely whipped, and where throughout the past century, the executive has rarely faced parliamentary rebellions, let alone defeats. And it also makes things uncomfortable when it comes to campaigning in the country, as political fights have almost always been under party umbrellas. I neither want nor have the time to discuss the Brexit-related debates and votes in Westminster over the past 3 years, but it's scarcely controversial to suggest that they've done nothing to enhance the reputation of or confidence in our constitutional system in the minds of the general public. And the almost theological nature of the Brexit discussion has served to polarize opinions and inflame passions. In 2015, under 5% of the UK population thought EU membership was the most important issue facing government. Now it has rocketed to 50% and is seen to be the most important issue by more than 3 times as many people as the next most important issue, the NHS. Having said that, I readily acknowledge that politics can be a very difficult exercise, and that's particularly true when it comes to Brexit. A number of the actions that are now criticised in connection with Brexit, carried out by the government, received general support, or at any rate very little criticism at the time. And a number of the problems following the referendum have no good answer. One feeling which I rather unexpectedly came away with after 8 years as a senior judge was sympathy for politicians when it came to media coverage. It's no exaggeration to say that there is relentless, partisan, grossly oversimplified, not infrequently positively misleading coverage of political issues. It seems to be a persistent feature of modern life. By contrast, judges have suffered less from the media, and when they do suffer, the attacks rarely last more than a day or two. Nevertheless, there were inappropriate attacks on the judges, the worst example of which, of course, was the scurrilous Daily Mail Enemies of the People front page following the Article 50 decision. To be fair, that seems to have been something of a one-off, but it was almost more notable for the lamentable government reaction, suggesting that to create a newspaper would infringe freedom of expression, a ludicrous and self-contradictory proposition. The Enemies of the People saga is nonetheless a relatively extreme example, but nonetheless an example of the approach of many newspapers when it comes to political or constitutional issues. They are more concerned with propaganda than with news, more interested in sensationalism rather than accuracy. So I fear that many newspapers are also contributing to a lack of confidence in all aspects of our constitutional system. But I would suggest that people in public life do contribute to this. In many cases by conducting deniable, off-the-record briefings to journalists, and sometimes by condoning unacceptable behavior in the name of freedom of the press. I wonder whether many such off-the-record briefings are in the public interest. And far from justifying bad behavior, surely freedom of the press carries responsibilities. Of course, one of the main reasons why the traditional media are so febrile is that they are being squeezed massively by the electronic media. Newspaper circulation over the past 20 years has reduced by 50%, in some cases, in the case of some newspapers, by 75%. And of course, the effect of the electronic media and the problems for democracy and the rule of law raised by blogs, tweets, and other form of messaging makes the problems I've been describing in relation to the traditional media almost pale into significance. For reasons of financial gain, political fanaticism, a desire to destabilize the system, and sometimes sheer mischievousness, electronic messaging is being used on an increasing scale to carry inflammatory misinformation, cynically catering to prejudices and cruelly preying on ignorance, all targeted and timed in a way in which a 20th century propagandist could only have dreamt of. On top of that, many people seem to regard tweeting as an opportunity to make violent and untrue, indeed positively criminal threats and statements. Electronic communications seem to engender a sort of disembodied shamelessness among many people. While censorship, blocking and removal of messages is unattractive and not without practical difficulties, and we certainly don't want to go the way of China, I suggest that we in society, politicians, lawyers, have a positive duty to take steps to fight back against this assault on our constitutional system, indeed on our whole way of life. As I mentioned at the start of this talk, democracy and the rule of law can only work in a society where the constitutional arrangements are generally accepted and respected. The various factors I've mentioned have caused many people to lose confidence in our system and to look sometimes to other less enlightened forms of government than we have currently enjoyed. The fact that we have such a make-it-up-as-you-go-along constitution has the advantage of greater flexibility, which is of significant value in a fast-changing world. But given the value of having something solid and secure to hold on at times of trouble and challenge, such a constitution can be something of a disadvantage. I should like to end by making it clear that it's not by any means all doom and gloom. For instance, there are still many more people wanting to come to the UK than wanting to leave, even from the EU. We are disproportionately successful in all areas of scientific research and in the number of outstanding universities we have. On many global measures, such as the Corruption Perception Index or Democratic Index, we do well. We are very big in technology startups, and we are very successful in financial and legal services. And more specifically, as I've mentioned, our consistent political and governmental success over the past 300 years should stand us in good stead, at least if we don't turn around and kick it in the face. Thank you very much.
Dominic, do come up and join us. Lord Neuberger, thank you very, very much. And such a wide-ranging speech. We're going to have about 5 minutes for questions, but let me just ask you both. It seems to me that when you have a referendum at the end of a deliberative process, you get a rather better outcome than when you have it at the start of one. If that is true, ought we to be very careful about calling for another one without building in that deliberation period?
It's certainly a valid point. The first referendum, the Brexit referendum, was a disaster. You should never ask. I mean, looking back on it, as an MP, I should never have allowed myself to be lulled into supporting an abstract question because it entirely glossed over the implementation. And take as a contrast that with the referendum in Ireland on abortion, where undoubtedly there was a long period of public build-up and discussion on a very clear subject, so that when people went to vote, they knew what it was they were voting on. Now, you can say that we have now learnt through a 3-year process of detailed debate many of the issues that should have been debated prior to the first referendum taking place. And I certainly do worry that, from my point of view, I think this is a political issue which we do need to try to bring to a conclusion, because it is, as long as it continues, very disruptive and diverting us from so many other issues. But it's right that if we have a further referendum, then the choices that are put forward on the ballot paper must be clear and must be implementable. So, for example, whilst I'm respectful that I have colleagues at Westminster who say they want leaving without a deal to be on the ballot paper, and they have a justifiable argument to put forward on that, what does it actually mean? And I think it will have to be spelt out very clearly what is intended if such a rather nebulous term is to go on. Now, some have also suggested we should have a build-up. And we should have citizens' assemblies and discussions about the future and an informed debate. I'm not necessarily against that, but I do emphasise that there is a thing called a ticking clock. Quite apart from anything else, our EU partners will, I think, not maintain their patience with us indefinitely. And there is a real necessity of bringing this matter to a close. So those things have to be balanced one against another.
Thank you. Okay, now we've got 2 ushers with mics, and we're going to take 3 questions. And I would like, I'm desperately looking to see if a woman has got her hand in the air. Yes, they do. Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to take 3 questions, please. Could the lady with this mic take this chap in the white shirt, and then we'll come to this chap here and that lady there in the nice scarf, 3 rows back. Hi.
Hi. We've mentioned, several people today have mentioned how abstract the result, the original question was. And it seems that the referendum, as I'm sure many people here agree, was very badly put together. So my question is, why was it so badly put together, and why didn't it require more of a supermajority, 2/3 vote in favour of one or the other, or perhaps 50% of the entire voting population, something that's popular in other referendums?
Thank you very much. And then there was this chap here, 2nd row back. Thank you. I will come further to the back in the next round.
Thank you, both. A couple of centuries ago, Schiller said that democracy is the dictatorship of the stupid, which was perhaps a bit cynical. Then a century ago, Hannah Arendt, in her Banality of Evil, said that perhaps people not thinking is what leads to evil. Now we have Michael Gove saying that people are sick of experts. How do we save democracy in a world where people no longer think and where disinformation wastes their time?
Thank you. This lady here, yeah. Or you can shout and I can relay the question to those that can't hear. Oh, there you go. It was working, I think. Just hold it. Yeah. Yeah. I can. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so if I may, I'm going to ask Lord Neuberger to take the first 2 questions. Yeah, I'm about to. Yeah, so the first 2 is why didn't we build in some kind of supermajority, or should we have done last time round? And how do we protect our democracy in an era where experts and thinking is shunned?
I think the make it up as you go along point I made means that people didn't really think about the referendum in any depth. And what we had was a referendum act modelled on the Referendum Act of 1975, when the Labour government, for similar internal party reasons, had a referendum, and it was just something of an action replay. If we'd had a constitution or we'd had a set of rules for referenda, then certainly all the sorts of points you make would have been put into it, because they would have been thinking about referenda in principle and what should go into a general referendum act, rather than let's quickly have a referendum to sort out the problem we've got. Now, I do think with a one-off referendum, there is a problem saying it's got to be a 66% or whatever majority, because you can see the argument that if it had been, let's say, 65% wanting to leave, and 35% wanting to stay, it would have been a slightly odd decision in our system, which consistently has had a simple majority, whether it's a general election for MPs or whether it's a by-election for a single seat, to suddenly have a system where the great majority of people wanted to leave, but it wasn't quite enough. If it was part of our constitutional system, that referenda with constitutional change in mind had to have a certain majority, that would have been easier to do. So that's my take on that point. As for rubbishing expert, rubbishing this, rubbishing that, political talk is often of that nature. It's off the cuff, it's simple, it's eye-catching, headline-catching. We've got to be careful if we supported the side that lost of seeing everything bad having resulted from, or the bad result having resulted from things that were said which were inappropriate. My general point is that a system that gives the public the right to vote for an MP every 5 years to re-elect their present MP or to get a new MP in, and then leaving it to the MPs to vote on laws, parliamentary democracy, is a system that served us very well and answers many of the problems which you've identified. And that's a system which we should have stuck with and should be sticking with.
Thank you. And the final question that is directed at Dominic is about the Conservative leadership election that is going on. Lots of the candidates advocating that they are going to take us out on no deal rather than have any extension after the 31st of October. And the question is whether Parliament should sit and wait for that to play out, as I understand it, or whether it should invoke what I think is Standing Order 14 and then maybe Standing Order 24, but I am in the presence of two lawyers who will certainly correct me if that is wrong, to legislate to mandate the Prime Minister to revoke Article 50 before the end of October the 31st if it looks like we haven't got a deal.
Thank you. I think you've got to understand the standing orders of the House are a pretty extraordinary thing. They are, in fact, leaving aside the laws which govern us, which Parliament has enacted and the judiciary interpret. The standing orders of the House of Commons are the Constitution of the United Kingdom. And they are the creation of years of accumulation of rules which the Commons has sole control over, except in so much as it chooses to surrender that control elsewhere. Since 1906, the Commons surrendered control of the order paper, that is the business of the House, to the government, effectively. Capable of changing it, but the government's business has priority, which means that the government is capable of manipulating the business to prevent the House of Commons from debating things it doesn't want the House of Commons to debate. The way in which Brexit unfolded with a government with no majority was perhaps inevitably that the House of Commons rediscovered that there might be circumstances in which could take back control of the order paper and debate matters which the government didn't want it to debate. Now, some people have said that was revolutionary, but actually I think it was rather evolutionary in a way. It was simply reflecting the fact the government didn't have a majority. In addition, the Speaker's interpretation of the standing orders has, on at least one occasion, been distinctly creative in that he's abandoned precedent as to the amendability of business motions of the House, which previously, with the use of the words forthwith, meant that they were not amendable. And that was what enabled the House of Commons to seize control of the order paper in order to enact, for example, the Cooper-Letwin legislation, and also enabled us to identify days on which we would debate the business of our choice. Now, actually, that power has since lapsed because we've moved into a new period. And it's not at all clear as to when the House of Commons could necessarily find the hook on which to take back control of the order paper, although it's possible that the Speaker, having shown interpretative flexibility in respect of the standing orders, might do so again, and ultimately, if the House by a majority wants that, then the Speaker's interpretation is entirely unassailable. So, yes, you're right, it's possible, but I think that the political reality is that between now and a new leader or Prime Minister coming in and that Prime Minister having an opportunity to consider what he or she wants to do next, I think it's rather unlikely that the House is going to try to seize control of the order paper again. But it does beg the question that if we are crashing out on the 31st of October, what is the latest stage at which the House of Commons can positively respond to try to head off such an eventuality if a Prime Minister was determined to do it? And of course, it is a matter of executive action because leaving on the 31st of October does not require any further primary legislation of any kind at all. Now, that's a very difficult question to answer. My personal view is that the crisis will come in early September, depending on what all the then Prime Minister decides to do. But how it pans out, I'm afraid I would not wish to speculate.
So thank you very much. I think the answer was no, but do write to your MP and tell them that you would quite like them to try and find a way of seizing control of the order paper. Please give a very big round of applause to both of our speakers. While we've already heard from quite a few lawyers tonight, the next one really is worth waiting to hear. She's extra special because Joanna Cherry QC is MP for Edinburgh South West, and she's going to, of course, be able to give us the view of the rule of law in the eyes of Scotland and our democratic deficit. We've had a lot of accents tonight. Oh, no, I'm being told she's not here. Okay, sorry. She's here. Oh, she is here. Oh, but it's Tanja first. Oh, sorry. I beg your pardon, Tanja. I'm very, very sorry. I will reintroduce Joanna, who, of course, is brilliant. And before that, we're going to hear from... are you a doctor or a professor, Tanja? I never remember. Professor Tanja Bueltmann. Please take to the stage and give a warm round of applause for Tanja.
I was going to make a queue jumper joke anyway, but now I guess I definitely can. Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and I guess going by the program, I'm not actually jumping the queue, but I was going to say that because I'm kind of jumping the queue, because thanks to Lord Neuberger, I can speak in the first place, because he gave me a little bit of time, so thank you very much for that. I'm also going to try and be very German and super efficient, so maybe we can make up a little bit of the time. But don't forget, I'm talking here as an individual, but I'm really talking about and for 5 million people, and I mean EU citizens at home in the UK, 3.6 million people like me who chose to come here and make our home here, and also our British friends who live in the EU, because together we were severely affected a couple of weeks ago by the denied my vote scandal, or that's what it has become known as. So the EU elections, of course, to us had a really special meaning in a sense, because it was the first time that we actually had some sort of say in all this Brexit catastrophe. Because don't forget, we've talked a lot about the manipulations of the referendum and democracy. Well, what is a democracy if those most immediately affected by the outcome of the referendum have no voice in the actual referendum? Now, I know that's a slightly separate question, but it is so important in this context, because that's why, to many EU citizens, the possibility of casting a vote in the EU elections was even more important, perhaps, than it might have otherwise been. And that's not least the case because, of course, we can choose. We can choose to vote in the country of our citizenship or, well, now also in the UK. And many EU citizens chose to do that because this is our home, something that many people seem to be impossible of conceiving as a reality, but it is. So what happened? If you are on Twitter, you probably saw really quickly on the day of the EU elections that the hashtag trending at #1 really quickly in the morning was not actually the one for the EU elections, but was the one called Denied My Vote. And that was because so many EU citizens were sharing their stories of having arrived in the polling station, finding their names crossed out on the list. I mean, just the very thought of it actually makes me quite physically sick, considering the context of this, you know, walking into the polling station, see your name crossed out, because they hadn't signed the so-called declaration form. Now, in itself, this is a known problem, because the same thing happened in 2014 already, because we have to register to vote, but we also have to sign this other form. That is a British peculiarity, if you like it. It's an EU law, but this is the British interpretation of it, that there is this second form that you have to sign. I actually couldn't vote, or rather my proxy, in the 2014 election for that reason. So I know exactly what it felt like, or what it feels like to be not allowed to vote. So a lot of people arrived and found out that way. Many people already knew beforehand, however, because we actually all, or campaigners at least, knew beforehand that this was about to happen. And to my mind, that is the actual scandal, because this is something that we knew was a problem, yet here we are. And we knew this because of what happened in 2014 and because the Electoral Commission, our friends there again, failed again, really, because they didn't take action. They promised after 2014 that they would take action, and they didn't really. Now, they tell us now that Brexit or the EU referendum is kind of the reason for that, because we thought we wouldn't have these elections. Well, what did they do between 2014 and 2016? So at a minimum, 2 years were wasted already, and that's how we ended up there. Now, I don't really believe in conspiracies. I've seen quite a lot of people on Twitter share all sorts of stories. If nothing else, I just don't think the government is actually capable of one. What we can say is that what happened in the EU elections to so many EU citizens, and also British in Europe, is based really on choices, and that's what makes a big difference here, because it could have been prevented and it wasn't. So as I say, I don't think it's a conspiracy, but choices were made. The Electoral Commission chose not to take action, not to tell councils, for example, to send us this form or to provide it in some easy, accessible way. Some councils did, other councils didn't. That's why it's a bit of a hodgepodge of a situation. But also other choices, for example, by the Prime Minister. So Joanna Cherry, who will talk after me, tried one day before the election, one more time, to try and get the Prime Minister to recognize that this is a problem. With cross-party support she did, and asked the question in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister didn't even answer the question, and by choosing that, effectively confirmed that the next day, denied my vote would happen. And that is why I think we can talk about this in terms of a deliberate voter suppression, because other choices could have been made and they were not made. And that's very clear. Now, as I say, this was happening to the group already most disenfranchised in this whole process, and that makes that even more catastrophic, really. And for British people who live in another EU country, the problem was for those who wanted to choose to vote in the UK. So some received their postal ballots after the election date, things like that. Some councils seem to have used low-cost carriers that already tell you on their website that they take 2 weeks to deliver a letter. So there's a series of issues here that really need proper investigation. And they also need proper investigation because of what has happened since. The Electoral Commission has already basically pushed away any responsibility or recognition of that. Worse, they have taken issue, it seems, with the fact that so many EU citizens have complained. So that's, of course, not a good look. I've already said that on Twitter, but I want to emphasize that. The scale of the problem isn't quite clear. We do know that the 3 million, an NGO looking after our rights here in the UK, prepared a form that people could use. It was downloaded 5,000 times. So that is maybe not as big as you think, but actually, 5,000 people going to download that form is quite something. Now, critically, as I say, I have to wrap up because I'm being told off. I think denied my vote cannot end with denied my vote. It has to have a legacy. And the legacy has to be that we have a discussion, a proper discussion about the franchise in this country. That is not just a point about EU citizens. We are kind of in the firing line. But it's also about British in Europe who've been out of the country for more than 15 years and cannot vote. It is also about all other immigrants who are disenfranchised in this system. So I will wrap up now, I promise. But I am wearing, well, different statements today, but this one is one I really wanted to talk about at the end. Nevertheless, she persisted. I will continue. It is all of our duty to continue, because as a German and as a historian, I know where this ends, and I'm not prepared to accept that. We have to take a stand. We all have to persist. For denied my vote in that context, but for democracy more broadly as well. Thank you.
Can I please just assure you, Tanja, your name was not crossed out. It just wasn't on my version of the programme. I'm so sorry. Tanja Bueltmann, everybody. I've already introduced her, so I'm not going to do it again. We are absolutely thrilled now to hear from somebody who doesn't have a Southeast English accent. We're going to be hearing from Joanna Cherry.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to follow Tanja. And I think she's right that what happened to the EU citizens who were denied their basic democratic right to vote on the 23rd of May is very illustrative of something that's wrong with democracy in the United Kingdom at the moment. And I'd just like to make a little plug for my colleagues in the Scottish Government, because we do allow EU citizens to vote in Scottish elections and in the Scottish independence referendum. I was slightly concerned when I saw that the title that I was to be speaking to this evening was Safeguarding Our Constitution, because as someone who came into politics to try and achieve an independent Scotland, you'll not be surprised to hear that safeguarding the current British Constitution is not at the top of the list of my aims in life. That said, what I do share with others who've spoken this evening is that I passionately care about democracy and the rule of law. So it's really a pleasure to be here this evening and to share a platform with friends from other parties, with Lord Neuberger, and those who are non-aligned, but all of whom share a commitment to democracy and the rule of law. Because whereas Brexit has certainly shone a particularly strong light on the democratic deficits in the British Constitution, I think if Brexit has done one good thing, it has allowed us to see how much can be achieved when people work across party lines and traditional divides, as has happened in the House of Commons, and dyed-in-the-wool Scot Nats like myself with a history in the Labour Party find myself frequently giving Dominic Grieve a standing ovation when he gets to his feet, because people like Dominic have worked cross-party to try and address what has occurred to all the nations of these islands as a result of the Brexit vote. And I think Dominic's fight to get a meaningful vote, the fight to get indicative votes in the House of Commons, and also the case which established that Britain could unilaterally revoke Article 50, which I took with an SNP colleague, 2 Greens and 2 Scottish Labour Party MEPs, both of whom sadly lost their seats a couple of weeks ago. I think these efforts have established what can be achieved if we cross traditional lines. And with that in mind, I want to talk just briefly this evening about something positive that's happening in Scotland, which could provide a model for all of the nations of the UK as we try to avoid the sort of disaster that Brexit has brought upon us in the future. And that is that in Scotland we now have a concrete plan to hold a series of citizens' assemblies in the autumn of this year. Now, Scotland's democratic deficit within the United Kingdom has been pretty well rehearsed. I spoke about it at the last convention. It has been highlighted by Brexit, but it existed before Brexit. After the Scottish independence referendum, I was one of 56 SNP MPs who were elected in the landslide of the 2015 general election, and we got 50% of the vote in Scotland. Because of the ridiculous first-past-the-post system, we got 56 out of the 59 MPs. But when the House of Commons came to debate the Scotland Act, which was supposedly to deliver more powers to the Scottish Parliament after the independence referendum, not one single amendment proposed by my party, the Scottish National Party, the party that had 50% of the vote in Scotland and 56 out of the 59 MPs, not one single one of the amendments we proposed to that bill was accepted. Now, that was prior to Brexit, but it's a real illustration of the democratic deficit that Scotland faces within the United Kingdom. And I know everyone in this room, and a lot of Remainers here, will know that Scotland voted 62% to remain in the EU referendum. But despite that, all the Scottish Government's efforts to be part of the negotiations, or to propose a compromise or to suggest that Scotland might have a differentiated deal have really met with a brick wall. And it's against that background that support for the idea of a second Scottish independence referendum is growing. And I certainly know in my constituency of Edinburgh South West, which was very much a no to independence constituency in 2014, I now meet many constituents who say if it's a choice between an independent Scotland in the European Union and Scotland remaining part of a Britain that has Brexited, then people prefer independence in the EU. But I think people are burned by the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, and in Scotland there's a very real sense that we don't want to have a divisive second independence referendum, and we want to try and carry out some groundwork for bringing as many people with us as possible. And it's against that idea, which Dominic referred to earlier when he spoke about the Citizens' Assembly, which preceded the Irish abortion referendum. I very much pushed for this idea to become SNP party policy, and I was delighted when a motion I put to SNP conference earlier this year was passed by acclaim, and Nicola Sturgeon took on board the idea that as part of the process of preparing voters in Scotland for a second independence referendum, there will be a Citizens' Assembly held in Scotland this autumn. Now, I know there'll be many people in this room who have been very keen to perhaps resolve the Brexit problem by holding a Citizens' Assembly across the United Kingdom, and I would say that I am not against that idea, and should one happen, I would like to see Scots participate in it. But the debate has moved ahead in Scotland, and the Scottish Government announced that these Citizens' Assemblies will take place. And for me, one of the things that the Citizens' Assemblies will do is that they will make sure that the usual vested interest groups, people with the power and people with the money, and the mainstream media will not be the only people who set the agenda of the debate about Scotland's future. And I think we can see that when we can look to what was achieved in Ireland on the incredibly divisive issue, as it was in the Republic of Ireland, of abortion, where 99 random citizens selected by a process of sortition were brought together to debate the issues around abortion rights with the assistance of experts, but not dictated to by experts. The experts were described as being on tap rather than on top, and specific advocates of pro or anti-abortion were not part of the Citizens' Assembly. They could make written submissions, but it was ordinary, unaligned Irish citizens who made up the Assembly, and that's what we intend to do in Scotland. And when Nicola Sturgeon announced that it was her intention to hold a second independence referendum within the term of the current Scottish Parliament, and that's probably likely to be later next year, she said that prior to doing that, she would set up this Citizens' Assembly to bring together a representative cross-section of people living in Scotland with an independent chair to be tasked with considering, in broad terms, what kind of country are we seeking to build? How can we best overcome the challenges we face, including those arising from Brexit? And what further work needs to be carried out to give people the detail they need to make an informed choice about the future of Scotland. And I'm certainly very much advocating that EU citizens living in Scotland should be part of the selectorate for those citizens' assemblies. And last week it was announced to the Scottish Parliament by my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Constitutional Affairs in Scotland, that considerable progress has been made in setting up the Citizens' Assembly. The Cabinet Secretary responsible for it has been to Ireland and met with the people who were responsible for running the Constitutional Convention that preceded the equal marriage vote and the Citizens' Assembly which preceded the abortion vote, and arranging for a panel of experts from Ireland, the United Kingdom and from overseas to inform the planning of the Scottish Government for the Citizens' Assembly. And the secretaries of the Irish Citizens' Assembly, the people who set it up, are being brought to Edinburgh later this month to brief members of the Scottish Parliament on how it worked in Ireland. And it's hoped that the announcements of who the independent chair will be and the formation of an expert steering group will be made over the summer, with a view to formulating the topics for deliberation and holding a first session in the autumn with 5 or 6 sessions completed by next spring. Now, I don't know what the topics for those citizens' assemblies are going to be. I know what the aims are. I have my own views. I'd really like to see the Citizens' Assembly in Scotland talk about Scotland's future relationship with Europe and how that interrelates with our choice of a currency. Rather a difficult and toxic subject for politicians, but perhaps something on which ordinary citizens could forge a way forward. I know people like Extinction Rebellion are very keen for a Citizens' Assembly on climate change, and although the Scottish Government has some world-leading legislation already on climate change, I think it being the crisis of our age, if you set Brexit to one side, then it probably would be a very good idea for the Citizens' Assembly in Scotland to look at that topic. So I just finish by saying that I'm very conscious that many people in this room will have been keen to have seen the sort of deliberative and participative democracy that a Citizens' Assembly embodies occur in England and across the whole of the United Kingdom. And I would say that, as I said at the last convention, I would always like to see Scotland and England continue in partnership. I'd like to see that as an equal partnership in the European Union, but I very much hope that as Scotland prepares to hold a second independence referendum, which I've no doubt this time will be won, the way in which we do that and the example of a Citizens' Assembly may serve as a little leaving gift, if you like, to the United Kingdom as a good example of what participative and deliberative democracy might look like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Does anyone know what the collective noun is for QCs? I mean, I think it's probably an expense or something like that, but we are incredibly lucky to have yet another one tonight who's going to be introducing our final panel of this evening and our penultimate session. Please give a warm welcome to Jessica Seymour QC. Sorry? Just introduce them.
So I'm hoping I'm going to have a panel coming up because I haven't actually prepared anything of any significance to say. This is Sonia Purnell. Sonia Purnell has written a biography of Boris Johnson that I hope you have read or at least know about. Nick Cohen, who you'll all know from The Observer, Guardian, and I saw even The Spectator today. And Femi, we all know from OFOC. And I think Ian Dunt, who you'll also all know, is going to join us in a second too. He's being mic'd. So I'm going to actually then do a little bit of an intro because if you'll have read the question, which many of the people on the panel hadn't, it's actually rather a tricky question. Crucially, it depends on the meaning of democracy. And I certainly, for one, believe that we have arrived where we are today because Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn and others have propagated a false idea as to what democracy actually is. Essentially, they have propagated the falsity that democracy is putting a tick in a box, and that the winner takes all, and that the majority view is the only view, the view that we must honour and respect irrespective of consequences. And in my view, this has created a space, effectively it was a gift to Nigel Farage and his friends, for them to use their winning narrative, the betrayal narrative. Democracy, of course, is much more. It involves consultation, compromise, and change, and crucially, it requires the rule of law and truth. Now, Theresa May steadfastly has refused to have any regard to the manifest and vast illegalities involved in the referendum process. And that itself really raised alarm bells for me, because you would have expected in former times a Prime Minister to be seriously concerned by what had happened. But indeed, she wouldn't even talk about it. And then, as to truth, we require the media in a democracy and the opposition to call out lies. And the media and the opposition have sadly failed us in that regard in the last 2 years as well. And I think that is why we have arrived where we are today, where we are talking potentially about a Trump in Britain. And the subtext perhaps is Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. So I'm going to ask Sonia first, who has the greatest knowledge of all of us as to the characteristics of Boris Johnson. Lord Neuberger and Dominic Grieve both talked about the fact that democracy depends on consent and decency, and that is what essentially protects us from anarchy. So, Sonia, I'm going to start with you and ask for your insight into Johnson and what, in your view, Johnson would do to enhance the standards of decency in public life.
Well, I think if you think May was bad, you probably haven't seen anything yet. Listen, I mean, Boris Johnson is a brilliant campaigner. He's a great writer. He has many gifts. Being truthful and decent are not amongst those gifts, unfortunately. I think it's right to call him a disruptor, a vandal. One of the quotes that he came out with about himself, which I think is most revealing, is that how much he enjoys the sound of breaking glass when he throws a brick into next door's greenhouse. Whether he's actually done it in real life, I don't know, but he's certainly done it in politics. He likes the sound of chaos. He likes the sound of being at the center of that chaos, having caused it, because it creates headlines. What really worries me, though, is his complete lack of believing that rules apply to him. He doesn't. He believes that he's above or behind or beside rules. They don't apply to him. And I think this is a really worrying thing. I actually really do fear him becoming Prime Minister, which it looks like he may well be in a few short months. If we look back at his record in office, if you look at when he was London Mayor, a lot of people say that he was a good mayor. I totally disagree. When he went in, he did very little. He didn't even really appoint people to prominent positions. Those he did appoint, some of whom ended up with criminal convictions. Eventually, they had to parachute someone in to run City Hall for him. The chief of staff, the chief civil servant, had to take him out to dinner and tell him to start behaving like a mayor. He was told off repeatedly by the UK Statistical Authority for making up statistics suggesting that his crime initiatives were successful when they were anything but. He lashed out at the UK Statistical Authority, again another regulator without teeth, describing the man in charge as a Labour stooge. That man used to be Margaret Thatcher's private secretary, so no Labour stooge here. But you see the same old thing with Boris Johnson again and again. If you criticise him, and believe me, I've been at the receiving end of this, you are abused. Think about what he said about business the other day. Fuck business. All business did was say, you know, are you sure what you're doing is the right thing for the British economy? Does he care? No, he really doesn't. He is a sort of sole trader, if you like. He believes in the big man theory of government. He does not believe in consensus and running a cabinet as sort of the first among equals. That is not something that he believes in. He's very much in the same playbook as Trump. And then when you look at, you know, his casual relationship with truth, that really is worrying. And I'm not just talking about the £350 million thing on the side of the bus. Again and again, we've had signs of him completely distorting the truth. If you cannot think about a Prime Minister that what they say is broadly correct, is broadly true, you are in really, really big trouble. And if you also have a Prime Minister who and thinks it's amusing or funny or self-aggrandizing to go around insulting foreigners, as both Boris Johnson and Donald Trump do repeatedly, that again, how are you representing your country in an efficient way? How are you making alliances and making friends? You're not. You're actually making it more difficult for your country. But also what worries me is that he doesn't really have a plan. He's not that interested in economics. I don't think he really has thought that through. I think if he does become Prime Minister, which is likely, I really wonder what he would do on his first day, what real plan he has for power, apart from getting back at his enemies, and I'm probably going to be on that list. Even his sister, Rachel Johnson, says he has a Sicilian attitude to those who've crossed him. This is not a good way to be a Prime Minister. This is not being a decent human being. This is not democracy as we know it and as we should know it. We are in danger of having a Prime Minister who holds many, many things in common with Donald Trump. It is up to all of us to call him out, to not let him get away with it. When he was Mayor of London, he did. For 8 years, he left so much undone in this city that should have been tackled and remains bad and is getting worse. We absolutely cannot let him get away with it again to the country at large, particularly when we're in the sort of crisis that we're in now. Okay.
So, Nick, could I turn from the person, the individual, to the generalities, the general threats to democracy, and whether we're moving in a sort of Trump-esque route or closer to Orban, Salvini? Maybe you'd give us your view.
Yes, I mean, I imagine a Leave voter sitting in this audience would look at the title of this panel and think, well, hold on a second, what on earth are these people talking about? You know, democracy in danger. If they want to stay in the EU, win a democratic referendum. If they want their ideas to govern the country, win a general election. You know, this is just, you know, think of any cliché thrown at you, ladies and gentlemen, Ramona, whatever, snowflakery, you know, trying to pretend that losing is a threat to democracy. No, you lost. The problem with that argument and the problem with it globally is this. Across the world now, Philippines, Brazil, Hungary, Poland, America to some extent under Trump, you see people winning elections and taking that as license. It's not just what you said at the beginning, majority power, majority gets its way, minorities are trampled on. The election victory is then used, and the process is most advanced in Europe, in Hungary, a country we should really pay a lot more attention to. It's only a tiny country and no one can understand their language, but it's extraordinary what is happening there. The victory is then used to knock out all institutions that provide a check on power and scrutinize power, the media, the civil service, and the judiciary. They're all packed with loyalists. And the ideology used to justify this, and this is used by Trump, and it's used in Britain on left and right. And I want to emphasize on the left as well, because we've got two future prime ministers at the moment, Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, and I want to make the point that the similarities between them are more apparent, more striking than the differences. And the way the argument goes is this: there is the people who are a circle of virtue. The people, even the regimes who put this forward, doesn't include everyone. They're quite happy to have enemies within. They are the 52% who voted for Remain in the case of the Brexit right. They are the believers in Jeremy, who are in the case of the left. They are Hungarians who back Orban. They are the white working class of the Midwest, whoever. And it is in their interest that government is run. Any institution, as I said, the judiciary, the civil service, the media, becomes the fake news, the lying media who are attacking the northern working class, whenever we, say anything like this is all going to be the most god-awful mess. No, you are not making a normal argument in a democracy, you're not engaging in the robust debates of democracy. You are, as one of Nigel Farage's MEPs put it the other day, insulting my voters by just asking questions and putting forward arguments. Once you're inside the chosen group, which is assigned virtuous, you can do anything. In the Labour Party now, you can sexually abuse women, you can be as racist as you like against Jews, but if you are inside, then not only are you protected, the criticisms against you are always tainted. You are doing this because you're furthering the agenda of big business, or in the case of J.K. Rowling, because you don't want to pay more tax, which is ludicrous as Joe moved to Scotland where you pay more tax, or because you're a Jew, or whatever. In the case of the right, and we saw this right from the start in the referendum campaign, when organisations like the Institute of Fiscal Studies, I don't know how many people here know this, it is crushing in its objectivity. I feel, you have to have all gaiety and life removed to you to even think of working for the Institute of Fiscal Studies. It is so proper. Queen Victoria would have thrown up her hands in horror and gone and taken some drugs. But even the Institute of Fiscal Studies, as soon as it started saying, look, these sums don't add up, this isn't true, no, you're financed by the EU. And we've gone from that small beginning in the referendum to it's a Remainer parliament secretly conspiring against the wishes of the people. We've had Lord Neuberger, I think he was sort of right in the way when he said the attack on the judiciary is enemies of the people was sort of a one-off. The attack on the civil service has been relentless. Incidentally, on named civil servants, it is so bad that when Sir Ivan Rogers was driven out, he had to give a warning to civil servants to say, I'm really sorry, your job is to lay out the hard truths for politicians. What they decide to do with them is up to them. You have no political, but you have to tell the truth. And I wonder at the moment how many civil servants are. Certainly, Sir Ivan worried when he was fired, it was to pour encourage the Leotra to bite their tongue and not raise awkward questions. Now, it strikes me that if either, I would say incidentally before slagging off all politicians, most politicians in the Labour and the Tory parties and the parties in between are not remotely like that. The British Conservative Party is not like Trump's Republicans. It may go that way as UKIP people come in, or ex-UKIP, but it's not that. Dominic Grieve may be an exception on the left of the party, but most Conservative MPs are like that. Most Labour MPs are like Stephen Kinnock, who was here a minute ago. They are not, they haven't got this weird post-Marxist, neo-Stalinist mentality. But that will change. But as things stand, our next Prime Minister will come from either of those cultures. The question then arises is what to do. And I go back to where I started. The point about democracies is to win. If you're beaten, you retreat, you try and learn some lessons from it. You try and accept, incidentally, which I hope, I don't always believe, I hope the People's Vote campaign is doing, you accept where you were wrong. You don't always say, oh, it was a biased media that made people do that, or it was Facebook, or it was blah, 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 blah. However true those statements may be, you accept, we made mistakes. If you lose in a democracy, you have to regroup, and I hope the People's Vote campaign do that. As for the rest of us, if you're a Green Party, Liberal Democrat, or Change supporter, are there any Change supporters left, by the way? But assuming there still are, if you're one of those, you absolutely insist that your parties, that Remain parties, reach electoral pacts, and with Plaid Cymru in Wales as well, and with the SNP in Scotland. You never allow again the absurdity of the European elections, where Nigel Farage was given a free run with a clear message, and all the rest of us were sitting there with calculators trying to work out the whole voting system, saying, well, should we vote Green? Should we vote Lib Dem? You say to your politicians, you say this is a national crisis. You say this is the biggest issue we're facing in our lifetimes. Will you damn well behave like that? And you damn well work together. If you're in the Labour Party, please, for God's sake, can you just get rid of a wretched man and get a proper leader of the opposition who actually opposes? And if you're in the Tories, I don't know, Ian and I have talked about this before, about how the cliches that come out of 2016. You know, all the people who are forgotten, and I'm from the north of England, all the people in the north of England who voted Remain are now entirely wiped out and replaced by a guy in Bury Market. You know, there were 3 million Tories, 4 million Tories who voted Remain.
I'm gonna, okay. Because I'm getting
signals.
So I'm going to turn to you, Femi, and ask you about our democratic structures, our constitutional structures, and can they provide some kind of protection against some narcissist who takes us down a crazy route?
So I see Donald Trump as a beast in a cage. And that cage is the American Constitution. And his presidency has shown us the strengths and weaknesses of that cage. So when he was elected, he wanted to do his blanket Muslim ban, but he got beaten down by the Constitution. So there were barriers in place, checks and balances. And he then managed to get it through somehow, but the point was we got to see where the weaknesses were. He started using executive orders because that was a weakness in the Constitution which allowed him to do what he wanted. The UK, well, I mean, Donald Trump obviously can use the Constitution the wrong way, which allows him to say phrases like, schools are gun-free zones, which makes them very dangerous places. But having a Constitution provides safety. The UK doesn't have a written Constitution. At law school, they refer to the UK's constitution as a set of understandings which nobody understands.
Yeah, and Neuberger said they make it up as they go along.
Yeah, and as a result of that, Parliament can do anything. Parliamentary sovereignty means Parliament can do anything. And you yourself have said in the past that for the past 40 years, the EU treaties have been our constitution. They've been the thing that, all right, we have rules, EU treaties and also the Human Rights Act via the Convention on Human Rights. Rules which mean that there are limits on what government can do to the people. And we are now in a situation where when Boris Johnson gets coronated as unelected Prime Minister, he, with the Tory majority and the DUP, who have a majority over Parliament, an absolute majority when you combine the two, can take us out of the EU without a deal, even though in 2017 the majority of voters voted for parties whose manifestos explicitly opposed no deal.
Well, you may have heard Ken Clarke saying on the Today programme that led some suggestion that she would just ignore Parliament. A motion in Parliament was a constitutional outrage, and as a lawyer I immediately thought, yeah, and so what? Constitutional outrage, outrageous. But I mean, what would you say about that? Do you think there is some kind of solution in there? Is there going to be some system which will kick in?
I think it's going to require the Speaker to help us out, to make sure that whatever the Parliament does to try and stop Boris Johnson just throwing the country off a cliff, we'll need his help. But like I said, the fact that it's even possible that we could be let out of the EU without a deal, even though the Parliament as it currently stands was voted in by people who chose manifestos who explicitly ruled out no deal, is a constitutional outrage. And it's partly aided by the fact that we have a first-past-the-post system, which obviously needs to go, because if it was done more proportionally, we'd get a better representation.
And we have an unelected president in a prime minister.
Yeah, exactly. And that is extremely dangerous. And the fact that we've got a very real risk that there ends up being a pact between Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage for power, and we've already seen the direction that he wants to take when he, during a referendum largely about European migration, he found it appropriate to use people from Syria who had nothing to do with Brexit. We've already seen the sort of direction that he wants to take the country, and there'll be very little to stop him because he's obviously very, very opposed to the Human Rights Act. Boris Johnson is opposed to the economic and social rights which are available under the EU. We have people that don't really have the same values as the UK about to be put in a lot of power.
Thank you. So, Ian, there is an argument that Trump is already here, and that, you know, Brexit and Trump, and it's all this part of the same. And perhaps you could give us your view on that, and also on how we're going to get out of this mess.
Yeah. I mean, look, Brexit is Trump. And not just that, but look, Theresa May was so shit at it that you couldn't tell that she was following the Trump playbook. But she followed it. She followed it instantly. She comes in, she talks about the will of the people as often as she can, thwarting the will of the people, the imaginary will of the people that you pointed out, the thing that cannot exist, because the people are not a homogenous lump. They are a collection of individuals with different views. She attacks institutions. She ended her time attacking Parliament itself for daring to oppose her in the first place. She called a general election because the opposition and the Lords were opposing her, again, the functioning of a sort of stable government, of a decent system. During the election, in a way that we forget now, she accused the EU of meddling in British affairs. All the time, this attitude of the people are under attack, the people are pure, the opposition we must face, therefore, can only be explained via a conspiracy theory that originates by aliens and outsiders, whether it's the Lords, whether it's foreigners, whether it's the opposition, whether it's MPs themselves. So she did it. It was just that she was so dull that you couldn't continue to pay attention to her doing it. There was no charisma. But she was still pursuing that playbook. Now, the danger then is that we get someone like Boris Johnson or someone like Nigel Farage who's better at it, who is more emotionally articulate, who is able to channel those things wider. And part of the solution is, of course, the way the Constitution operates, the way the institutions operate. But a lot of the solution to this stuff is simply the way that we function as people, the way that we resisted ourselves. Now, part of that is when you spot a politician who was using emotions without any policy behind them, without any actual rationality, without any evidence behind them, you know that you have a demagogue that just wants to exist now. And that is exactly where we are with Farage. This is different to using emotions in an argument that is still anchored down with evidence. When all it is emotions, they are trying to find a way of escaping scrutiny. So when they elect them, people have elected Nigel Farage in the European Parliament, how the fuck do you know what he's going to do? How can you hold him to account? Because he never told you what he was going to do. All he ever said was national humiliation, enemies within and without, I will fix it. The second part of standing up to this, and there's really no more important thing to do as an individual, is you notice that they always go for minorities. Every time. What is the connection between Trump in America, between Orban in Hungary, Salvini, the Brexit vote? Immigrants. It's always the immigrants that they go for, whether it's the Mexicans, whether it's refugees coming in, whether it's freedom of movement. Over and over across the world, the other in every one of these situations is immigrants. And the key to fixing this thing, to standing up to these people, is you stand up for immigrants as rule one.
Well, thank you all very much, and thank you all for your great insights. I think we're coming towards the end. There's another closing speech, so we better get off the stage.
So before you all do depart, please don't. please get back in your seats, because closing the convention this evening and talking to us about the way forward, and by God do we need one after everything we've heard tonight, you know, there's got to be a route through all of this, is Stephen Kinnock. He's the MP for Aberavon, and he is head of the new All Party Parliamentary Group on electoral campaigning and transparency. And he's going to be telling us about some of their recommendations about how we are going to upgrade our political system, and my goodness do we need it. Please give a very warm welcome to Stephen.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi, for that kind introduction. And I'd also just like to say a word of thanks to Henry for the crucial work that he's doing. In fact, I think Henry and the entire team do deserve a round of applause. If you could just show our... And it really is an honor to follow so many brilliant and esteemed speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, for far too long, we've taken our democracy for granted. We've been complacent, and our complacency has allowed malign forces to subvert our rules and undermine our institutions. It's not just a British phenomenon, of course. Dark money and dirty data is a real and present threat across the West. A recent report by the Atlantic Council, Democracy in the Crosshairs, included 3 case studies: Aaron Banks' funding of the Leave campaigns in the UK, the opaque source of the money behind the rise of the German far-right party Alternative for Deutschland, and the staggering number of donations received by Donald Trump's campaign, which fell below the $200 threshold at which donors must be identified. Now, I know that it can sometimes feel that we're helpless in the face of the tsunami of money and data that is smashing through our flimsy defenses and sweeping all before it. But I'm here to tell you today that we are fighting back. I'm here today to tell you that we will not go gently into that dark night. No, we're going to take a stand. And I'm absolutely convinced that we can and that we will win this battle. Our newly created All-Party Parliamentary Group for Electoral Campaigning Transparency, which I am proud to chair, certainly doesn't have all the answers. But the very fact that we have such a strong and influential group of vice chairs reflects the fact that parliamentarians have woken up and realized that our democracy is under threat and that we must do something about it. Brilliantly supported by the campaign group Fair Vote UK, our APPG includes vice chairs from 5 different political parties, including Ken Clarke, Caroline Lucas, Vera Hobhouse, Owen Smith, and Deirdre Brock. And we are also working closely with the Electoral Commission and the Electoral Reform Society. Our work will focus on 3 specific areas. First, transparency. How we make sure that citizens have access to information, both offline and online, in terms of election and referendum campaigns. Second, deterrence. How we offer the Electoral Commission the tools it needs to deter and, if necessary, penalise adequately. And third, monitoring. How we ensure that there is a process to review where campaigning laws are up to date and can be reformed immediately when needed. We believe that these are the 3 key ingredients to ensuring the public feels confident that the system works. It will be for others to tackle issues such as fake news and setting spending limits. Our core aim will be to guarantee that the rules that exist are enforced and processes are transparent. Parliament has a portcullis as its emblem because it's our job to safeguard the culture, institutions, systems and processes upon which our democratic society is based. I founded this APPG because I'm absolutely convinced that the vast majority of MPs understand that this is our solemn duty, but that we are lacking the tools to carry it out. I must stress that our APPG will look forward, not backwards. We recognise that this issue is bigger than Brexit, and that the focus must now be on laying the groundwork for future elections and referendums, rather than attempt to overturn the result of the 2016 vote. Why? Well, firstly, because any lawyer will tell you that it's almost impossible to make a link between the extra money spent and the extra votes cast in favour of the Leave campaigns. Secondly, because there is no legal basis to rerun the referendum, and thirdly, because we know that we'll get precisely nowhere if we allow our APPG to be sucked into the vortex of the Brexit debate. That said, however, we do need to learn from the past, and the APPG has been founded in large part as a response to the appalling behaviour of the Leave campaigns. My first real understanding of the Leave campaign's unlawful activities date right back to early 2017, when I received a tip-off from a trusted source who told me they'd been informed by someone prominent in the Leave campaign that Vote Leave had been working with BeLeave in ways which contravened electoral law. Donations between campaign groups are allowed, but not if there is coordination between the two, and it was clear that there had been coordination. I wrote to the Electoral Commission and to the Metropolitan Police to highlight my concerns about the relationship between Vote Leave and BeLeave, and I also detailed concerns about unreported spending and donations in kind. The Electoral Commission's response was underwhelming, to put it mildly. They seem to be sorely lacking in investigatory capability and legislative bite, essentially a toothless watchdog, unable to adequately investigate activities taking place under their noses. It was only the courage and the tenacity of the whistleblowers and of Carole and of so many people you've heard from tonight that finally blew the lid on the activities of Vote Leave and BeLeave, ultimately leading to a fine of £61,000 for Vote Leave and £20,000 for BeLeave. Meanwhile, investigations were also taking place into Cambridge Analytica's harvesting of Facebook data, resulting in a £500,000 fine. And then there was Leave.eu, the unofficial Brexit campaign bankrolled by Aaron Banks, which was found guilty of multiple breaches of electoral law, fined £70,000 and referred to the Metropolitan Police for suspected criminal offences. And having written to the Electoral Commission and the Metropolitan Police about Mr. Banks in April 2017, and again in June 2018, I am pleased that as of November 17, Mr. Banks has been the subject of a National Crime Agency investigation relating to the source of the £8 million that he donated to the Leave campaigns. Now, the exposure of malpractice and the ensuing fines feel like a victory of sorts, but the reality is that they are far from being a deterrent. Indeed, Aaron Banks described these paltry fines as just the cost of doing business. This is because the Electoral Commission was established at a time when political campaigning centred around door-knocking and leafleting. It is an analogue regulator in a digital age. Digital campaigning and online political engagement have revolutionised politics, so it is critical that the Commission is given the tools and the resources it needs to make it fit for purpose in the 21st century. Fair Vote was one of the first organisations to recognise the flaws in the current system, and I worked with them to put forward 4 key recommendations. First, we should look at which powers sit best with the Electoral Commission and which should sit with the police. There should also be unlimited fines for electoral offences, rather than a maximum of £20,000, which is utterly insufficient. Second, all political campaigns should be made to report spending online. Third, financial transfers from designated campaign groups during referendums must be banned. And fourth, we should regulate paid political digital advertising in the election period with a digital Bill of Rights for democracy. Our new APPG will now conduct an inquiry with a view to publishing a green paper that will include recommendations for legislative changes and institutional reform. We will be asking a wide range of organisations to submit evidence, including the Electoral Commission itself, the Information Commissioner, the DCMS Select Committee, the Cabinet Office, the Electoral Reform Society, Full Fact, the Institute for Statecraft, and indeed PayPal. But ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that our APPG will only be tackling the tip of the iceberg. There are profound questions to be answered that go well beyond the scope of our work. In his book, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, Timothy Snyder writes, "Until recently, we had convinced ourselves that the seemingly distant traumas of fascism, Nazism, and communism were receding into irrelevance. We allowed ourselves to accept the politics of inevitability, the sense that history would move in only one direction, towards liberal democracy. And in doing so, we have lowered our defenses and opened the door to precisely the kinds of regimes we had told ourselves would never return. And Snyder is right. We are engaged in a battle for the very soul of our democracy. Yes, robust competition between opponents is a vital element of a healthy and pluralistic politics. But we now live in a world where the protagonists are playing to win at any cost. A world where campaign finance rules are brazenly flouted. A world where Nigel Farage can describe Parliament Square as enemy territory, and where the Daily Mail can describe our judiciary as the enemies of the people. A world where Kate Hoey can dismiss an electoral commission report on the malpractice of the Vote Leave campaign on the grounds that most of the people on the commission are active Remainers. We cannot go on like this. We must act. In my view, we must urgently build a new political culture on the basis of 3 cornerstones. First, integrity. We have to build processes, systems, and institutions that inspire trust, hence the launch of our APPG. Second, we must restore faith in the facts. Michael Gove's "we've had enough of experts" comment was typical of our downward spiral from healthy skepticism to Orwellian doublethink. Putin and Trump have constantly muddied the waters between fact and fiction, while social media has become a playground for the conspiracy theorists. The social media platforms are making eye-watering profits. We need them to step up and invest a huge amount more in fact-checking and balance. They should stop behaving like platforms and start behaving like publishers. And the third cornerstone is empathy. We need to stop pitting one group against another. This is happening everywhere we look, whether it's Parliament versus the people, business versus workers, city versus town, young versus old, graduates versus non-graduates, north versus south, or Remain versus Leave. We are dangerously polarized, and we are teetering on the brink of a culture war. We need to rebuild our sense of shared citizenship, reciprocal obligations, common purpose, and empathy. We must learn to see the world through the eyes of others. If we are to reunite our deeply divided country, we need actions, not just words. We need leaders who unite rather than polarize. And we need reform from the bottom up, not just the top down. We need a constitutional convention leading to a written, codified constitution. We need a new electoral system based on proportional representation. Yeah, that's what we need. And we need radical devolution and decentralization of power, particularly across England. Ladies and gentlemen, our democratic system may have looked relatively healthy on the outside, but we have learned that inside it was rotten to the core. We all know that the Leave campaign leaders never expected to win, never had a manifesto or a leader they could unite behind, and none of them ever really wanted the poisoned chalice of leading the country through the ensuing political and constitutional crisis. But never again can we allow there to be such a profound disconnect between expectations, reality, and accountability. Never again can we allow a game-changing democratic event to take place without the slightest thought given to how to deal with the consequences. And never again can we allow our politicians to just make it up as they go along. Politics is not a game. It is a serious business with real-life consequences. The British political class used to be defined by its pragmatism and its agility, but for years now, all we have seen is its shambolic arrogance. Just think of David Davis turning up to meetings with Michel Barnier without a sheet of paper to his name. Or David Cameron whistling a merry tune, having just delivered his resignation speech on the steps of Number 10. Or just think of Boris Johnson. Well, just think of Boris Johnson. So, we must now strain every sinew to strengthen our institutions. We must make it our mission to clear away the fake news, dodgy data, and dirty money that is polluting our democracy. And we must make it our defining purpose to save our precious democracy and to safeguard it for future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, our most dangerous enemy is complacency, but I can assure you that we are complacent no longer. Thank you.
Staying this long, it's very late. I think you have heard some of the most kind of engaging and wonderful political debate and insight tonight. And I want to thank you for coming and staying the length of the distance. I also ask you to subscribe to the convention. Ooh, here it works. Subscribe to the convention website newsletter so we can tell you about upcoming events. Thank you very much and have a good evening.